This is Chapter 53 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 53. Every now and then in these days the boys used to tell me I ought to get one Jim Blaine to tell me the stirring story of his grandfather's old ram, but they always added that I must not mention the matter unless Jim was drunk at the time, but just comfortably and sociably drunk. They kept this up until my curiosity was on the rack to hear the story. I got to haunting Blaine, but it was of no use. The boys always found fault with his condition. He was often moderately but never satisfactorily drunk. I never watched a man's condition with such absorbing interest, such anxious solicitude. I never so pined to see a man uncompromisingly drunk before. At last, one evening, I hurried to his cabin, for I learned that this time his situation was such that even the most fastidious could find no fault with it. He was tranquilly, serenely, symmetrically drunk, not a hiccup to mar his voice, not a cloud upon his brain thick enough to obscure his memory. As I entered, he was sitting upon an empty powder keg, with a clay pipe in one hand and the other raised to command silence. His face was round, red, and very serious. His throat was bare and his hair tumbled. In general appearance and costume he was a stalwart miner of the period. On the pine table stood a candle, and its dim light revealed the boys sitting here and there on bunks, candle-boxes, powder kegs, etc. They said, "Shh, don't speak. He's going to commence." "The story of the old ram." I found a seat at once, and Blaine said, "I don't reckon them times will ever come again. There never was a more bullier old ram than what he was. Grandfather fetched him from Illinois, and got him of a man by the name of Yates, Bill Yates. Maybe you might have heard of him. His father was a deacon, Baptist, and he was a rustler, too. A man had to get up rather early to get the start of old Thankful Yates. It was him that put the Greens up to jinin' teams with my grandfather when he moved west. Seth Green was probably the pick of the flock. He married a Wilkerson, Sarah Wilkerson, good creetur. She was. One of the likeliest heifers that was ever raised in old Stoddard, everybody said that knowed her. She could heft a barrel of flour as easy as I could flirt a flapjack. And spin? Don't mention it. Independent? When Sile Hawkins come a-browsing around her, she let him know that for all his tin he couldn't trot in harness alongside of her. You see, Sile Hawkins was—no, it weren't Sile Hawkins after all. It was a galoot by the name of Filkins. I disremember his first name, but he was a stump, comin' to prayer meeting drunk one night, hurraying for Nixon because he thought it was a primary, and old Deacon Ferguson up and scooted him through the window, and he lit on old Miss Jefferson's head, poor old filly. She was a good soul, had a glass eye, and used to lend it to old Miss Wagner that hadn't any, to receive company in. It weren't big enough, and Miss Wagner weren't noticin'. It would get twisted round in the socket and look up maybe, or out to one side, and every which way, while t'other one was looking as straight ahead as a spyglass. Grown people didn't mind it, but it most always made the children cry, it was so sort of skeery. She tried packing it in raw cotton, but it wouldn't work somehow. The cotton would get loose and stick out and look so kind of awful that the children couldn't stand it no way. She was always dropping it out and turning it up her old dead light on the company empty and making them uncomfortable, because she never could tell when it hopped out, being blind on that side, you see. So somebody would have to hunch her and say, "Your game eye has fetched loose, Miss Wagner dear," and then all of them would have to sit and wait till she jammed it in again. Wrong side before, as a general thing, and green as a bird's egg, being a bashful creetur and easy sot back before company. But being wrong side before warn't much difference anyway, because her own eye was sky blue, and the glass one was yaller on the front side, so whichever way she turned it, didn't match nohow. Old Miss Wagner was considerable on the borrow, she was. When she had a quiltin' or Dorcas society at her house, she generally borrowed Miss Higgins' wooden leg to stump round on. It was considerable shorter than her other pin. but much she minded that. She said she couldn't bide crutches when she had company, 'cause they were so slow. Said when she had company and things had to be done, she wanted to get up and hump herself. She was as bald as a jug, and so she used to borrow Miss Jacobs's wig. Miss Jacobs was the coffin peddler's wife. A ratty old buzzard he was, that used to go roosting around where people was sick, waiting for 'em, and there that old rip would sit all day in the shade on a coffin that he judged would fit the candidate, and if it was a slow customer and kind of uncertain, he'd fetch his rations and a blanket along and sleep in the coffin nights. He was anchored out that way in frosty weather for about 3 weeks once, before old Robbins's place, waiting for him. And after that, for as much as 2 years, Jacobs was not on speaking terms with the old man on account of his disappointing him. He got one of his feet froze and lost money, too, because old Robbins took a favorable turn and got well. The next time Robbins got sick, Jacobs tried to make up with him and varnished up the same old coffin and fetched it along, but old Robbins was too many for him. He had him in and 'peared to be powerful weak. He bought the coffin for $10, and Jacobs was to pay it back, and 25 more besides if Robbins didn't like the coffin after he'd tried it. And then Robbins died, and at the funeral he bursted off the lid and riz up in his shroud and told the parson to let up on the performances, because he could not stand such a coffin as that. You see, he had been in a trance once before when he was young, and he took the chances on another, calculating that if he made the trip it was money in his pocket, and if he missed fire he couldn't lose a cent. And by George, he sued Jacobs for the rhino and got judgment, and he set up the coffin in his back parlor and said he allowed to take his time now. It was always an aggravation to Jacobs, the way that miserable old thing acted. He moved back to Indiany pretty soon, went to Wellsville. Wellsville was the place the Hagedorns was from. Mighty fine family, old Maryland stock. Old Squire Hagedorn could carry around more mixed liquor and cuss better than most any man I ever see. His second wife was the Widder Billings, she that was Becky Martin. Her dam was Deacon Dunlap's first wife. Her oldest child, Maria, married a missionary and died in grace, et up by the savages. They et him too, poor feller, biled him. It warn't the custom, so they say, but they explained to friends of his'n that went down there to bring away his things that they'd tried missionaries every other way and never could get any good out of them, and so it annoyed all his relations to find out that that man's life was fooled away just out of a derned experiment, so to speak. But mind you, there ain't anything ever really lost. Everything that people can't understand and don't see the reason of does good if you only hold on and give it a fair shake. Providence don't fire no blank cartridges, boys. That there missionary's substance, unbeknownst to himself, actually converted every last one of them heathens that took a chance at the barbecue. Nothing ever fetched them but that. Don't tell me it was an accident that he was biled. There ain't no such thing as an accident. When my Uncle Lem was leaning up agin a scaffolding once, sick or drunk or something, an Irishman with a hod full of bricks fell on him out of the 3rd story and broke the old man's back in 2 places. People said it was an accident. Much accident there was about that. He didn't know what he was there for, but he was there for a good object. If he hadn't been there, the Irishman would have been killed. Nobody can ever make me believe anything different from that. Uncle Lem's dog was there. Why didn't the Irishman fall on the dog? Because the dog would a seen him a-comin' and stood from under. That's the reason the dog warn't appointed. A dog can't be depended on to carry out a special providence. Mark my words, it was a put-up thing. Accidents don't happen, boys. Uncle Lem's dog, I wish you could seen that dog. He was a reg'lar shepherd, or rather he was part bull and part shepherd. Splendid animal. Belonged to Parson Hagar before Uncle Lem got him. Parson Hagar belonged to the Western Reserve Hagars, prime family. His mother was a Watson. One of his sisters married a Wheeler. They settled in Morgan County, and he got nipped by the machinery in a carpet factory and went through in less than a quarter of a minute. His widder bought the piece of carpet that had his remains wove in it, and people come 100 miles to attend the funeral. There was 14 yards in the piece. She wouldn't let 'em roll him up, and planted him just so, full length. The church was middlin' small where they preached the funeral, and they had to let one end of the coffin stick out the window. They didn't bury him. They planted one end and let him stand up, same as a monument. And they nailed a sign on it and put on it, "Sacred to the memory of 14 yards of 3-ply carpet containing all that was mortal of William Wee." Jim Blaine had been growing gradually drowsy and drowsier. His head nodded once, twice, 3 times, dropped peacefully upon his breast, and he fell tranquilly asleep. The tears were running down the boy's cheeks. They were suffocating with suppressed laughter, and had been from the start, though I had never noticed it. I perceived that I was sold. I learned then that Jim Blaine's peculiarity was that whenever he reached a certain stage of intoxication, no human power could keep him from setting out, with impressive unction, to tell about a wonderful adventure which he had once had with his grandfather's old ram, and the mention of the ram in the first sentence was as far as any man had ever heard him get concerning it. He always maundered off interminably from one thing to another till his whiskey got the best of him and he fell asleep. What the thing was that happened to him and his grandfather's old ram is a dark mystery to this day, for nobody has ever yet found out. End of chapter 53. This is chapter 54 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 54. Of course there was a large Chinese population in Virginia. It is the case with every town and city on the Pacific coast. They are a harmless race when white men either let them alone or treat them no worse than dogs. In fact, they are almost entirely harmless anyhow, for they seldom think of resenting the vilest insults or the cruelest injuries. They are quiet, peaceable, tractable, free from drunkenness, and they are as industrious as the day is long. A disorderly Chinaman is rare, and a lazy one does not exist. So long as a Chinaman has strength to use his hands, he needs no support from anybody. White men often complain of want of work, but a Chinaman offers no such complaint. He always manages to find something to do. He is a great convenience to everybody, even to the worst class of white men, for he bears the most of their sins, suffering fines for their petty thefts, imprisonment for their robberies, and death for their murders. Any white man can swear a Chinaman's life away in the courts, but no Chinaman can testify against a white man. Ours is the land of the free. Nobody denies that. Nobody challenges it. Maybe it is because we won't let other people testify. As I write, news comes that in broad daylight in San Francisco some boys have stoned an inoffensive Chinaman to death, and that although a large crowd witnessed the shameful deed, no one interfered. There are 70,000 and possibly 100,000 Chinamen on the Pacific coast. There were about 1,000 in Virginia. They were penned into a Chinese quarter, a thing which they do not particularly object to, as they are fond of herding together. Their buildings were of wood, usually only 1 story high, and set thickly together along streets scarcely wide enough for a wagon to pass through. Their quarter was a little removed from the rest of the town. The chief employment of Chinamen in towns is to wash clothing. They always send a bill, like this below, pinned to the clothes. It is mere ceremony, for it does not enlighten the customer much. Their price for washing was $2.50 per dozen, rather cheaper than white people could afford to wash for at that time. A very common sign on the Chinese houses was, "See Yup, Washer and Ironer," "Hung Wo, Washer," "Sam Sing and Ah Hop, Washing." The house servants, cooks, etc., in California and Nevada were chiefly Chinamen. There were few white servants, and no China women so employed. Chinamen make good house servants, being quick, obedient, patient, quick to learn, and tirelessly industrious. They do not need to be taught a thing twice, as a general thing. They are imitative. If a Chinaman were to see his master break up a center table in a passion and kindle a fire with it, that Chinaman would be likely to resort to the furniture for fuel forever afterward. All Chinamen can read, write, and cipher with easy facility. Pity but all our petted voters could. In California they rent little patches of ground and do a deal of gardening. They will raise surprising crops of vegetables on a sand pile. They waste nothing. What is rubbish to a Christian, a Chinaman carefully preserves and makes useful in one way or another. He gathers up all the old oyster and sardine cans that white people throw away, and procures marketable tin and solder from them by melting. He gathers up old bones and turns them into manure. In California he gets a living out of old mining claims that white men have abandoned as exhausted and worthless, and then the officers come down on him once a month with an exorbitant swindle to which the legislature has given the broad, general name of foreign mining tax, but it is usually inflicted on no foreigners but Chinamen. This swindle has in some cases been repeated once or twice on the same victim in the course of the same month, but the public treasury was not additionally enriched by it, probably. Chinamen hold their dead in great reverence. They worship their departed ancestors, in fact. Hence, in China, a man's front yard, back yard, or any other part of his premises, is made his family burying ground, in order that he may visit the graves at any and all times. Therefore that huge empire is one mighty cemetery. It is ridged and ringled from its center to its circumference with graves, and inasmuch as every foot of ground must be made to do its utmost, in China, lest the swarming population suffer for food, the very graves are cultivated and yield a harvest, custom holding this to be no dishonor to the dead. Since the departed are held in such worshipful reverence, a Chinaman cannot bear that any indignity be offered the places where they sleep. Mr. Burlingame said that herein lay China's bitter opposition to railroads. A road could not be built anywhere in the empire without disturbing the graves of their ancestors or friends. A Chinaman hardly believes he could enjoy the hereafter except his body lay in his beloved China. Also, he desires to receive, himself, after death, that worship with which he has honored his dead that preceded him. Therefore, if he visits a foreign country, he makes arrangements to have his bones returned to China in case he dies. If he hires to go to a foreign country on a labor contract, there is always a stipulation that his body shall be taken back to China if he dies. If the government sells a gang of coolies to a foreigner for the usual 5-year term, it is specified in the contract that their bodies shall be restored to China in case of death. On the Pacific coast the Chinamen all belong to one or another of several great companies or organizations, and these companies keep track of their members, register their names, and ship their bodies home when they die. The Si Yup Company is held to be the largest of these. The Ning Yong Company is next, and numbers 18,000 members on the coast. Its headquarters are at San Francisco, where it has a costly temple, several great officers, one of whom keeps regal state in seclusion and cannot be approached by common humanity, and a numerous priesthood. In it I was shown a register of its members, with the dead and the date of their shipment to China duly marked. Every ship that sails from San Francisco carries away a heavy freight of Chinese corpses, or did at least until the legislature, with an ingenious refinement of Christian cruelty, forbade the shipments as a neat underhanded way of deterring Chinese immigration. The bill was offered, whether it passed or not. It is my impression that it passed. There was another bill, it became a law, compelling every incoming Chinaman to be vaccinated on the wharf and pay a duly appointed quack (no decent doctor would defile himself with such legalized robbery) $10 for it. As few importers of Chinese would want to go to an expense like that, the lawmakers thought this would be another heavy blow to Chinese immigration. What the Chinese quarter of Virginia was like, or indeed what the Chinese quarter of any Pacific coast town was and is like, may be gathered from this item, which I printed in the Enterprise while reporting for that paper. Chinatown. Accompanied by a fellow reporter, we made a trip through our Chinese quarter the other night. The Chinese have built their portion of the city to suit themselves, and as they keep neither carriages nor wagons, their streets are not wide enough, as a general thing, to admit the passage of vehicles. At 10 o'clock at night the Chinaman may be seen in all his glory, in every little cooped-up dingy cavern of a hut, faint with the odor of burning Josh lights, and with nothing to see the gloom by save the sickly, guttering tallow candle, were 2 or 3 yellow, long-tailed vagabonds coiled up on a sort of short truckle-bed, smoking opium, motionless, and with their lusterless eyes turned inward from excess of satisfaction, or rather the recent smoker looks thus, immediately after having passed the pipe to his neighbor, for opium smoking is a comfortless operation and requires constant attention. A lamp sits on the bed, the length of the long pipe-stem from the smoker's mouth. He puts a pellet of opium on the end of a wire, sets it on fire, and plasters it into the pipe much as a Christian would fill a hole with putty. Then he applies the bowl to the lamp and proceeds to smoke, and the stewing and frying of the drug and the gurgling of the juices in the stem would well nigh turn the stomach of a statue. John likes it, though. It soothes him. He takes about 2 dozen whiffs, and then rolls over to dream. Heaven knows what, for we could not imagine by looking at the soggy creature. Possibly in his visions he travels far away from the gross world and his regular washing, and feast on succulent rats and birds' nests in paradise. Mr. Ah Sing keeps a general grocery and provision store at No. 13 Wang Street. He lavished his hospitality upon our party in the friendliest way. He had various kinds of colored and colorless wines and brandies, with unpronounceable names, imported from China in little crockery jugs, and which he offered to us in dainty little miniature wash-basins of porcelain. He offered us a mess of birds' nests, also small, neat sausages, of which we could have swallowed several yards if we had chosen to try, but we suspected that each link contained the corpse of a mouse, and therefore refrained. Mr. Sing had in his store 1,000 articles of merchandise, curious to behold, impossible to imagine the uses of, and beyond our ability to describe. His ducks, however, and his eggs we could understand. The former were split open and flattened out like codfish, and came from China in that shape, and the latter were plastered over with some kind of paste which kept them fresh and palatable through the long voyage. We found Mr. Hong Wo, No. 37 Chow Chow Street, making up a lottery scheme. In fact, we found a dozen others occupied in the same way in various parts of the quarter, for about every third Chinaman runs a lottery, and the balance of the tribe buck at it. Tom, who speaks faultless English and used to be chief and only cook to the Territorial Enterprise when the establishment kept bachelors' halls 2 years ago, said that some time Chinaman buy ticket $1 hap, catch 'em 2-300, sometime no catch 'em anything. Lottery like one man fight 'em 70. Maybe he whip, maybe he get whip, heself. Welly good. However, the percentage being 69 against him, the chances are, as a general thing, that he get whip heself. He could not see that these lotteries differed in any respect from our own, save that the figures being Chinese, no ignorant white man might ever hope to succeed in telling t'other from which. The manner of drawing is similar to ours. Mr. C. Yupp keeps a fancy store on Live Fox Street. He sold us fans of white feathers, gorgeously ornamented, perfumery that smelled like Limburger cheese, Chinese pens, and watch charms made of a stone unscratchable with steel instruments, yet polished and tinted like the inner coat of a sea-shell. As tokens of his esteem, C. Yupp presented the party with gaudy plumes made of gold tinsel and trimmed with peacock's feathers. We ate chow-chow with chopsticks in the celestial restaurants. Our comrade chided the moon-eyed damsels in front of the houses for their want of feminine reserve. We received protecting Josh lights from our hosts, and dickered for a pagan god or two. Finally, we were impressed with the genius of a Chinese bookkeeper. He figured up his accounts on a machine like a gridiron with buttons strung on its bars. The different rows represented units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. He fingered them with incredible rapidity. In fact, he pushed them from place to place as fast as a musical professor's fingers travel over the keys of a piano. They are a kindly disposed, well-meaning race, and are respected and well treated by the upper classes all over the Pacific coast. No Californian gentleman or lady ever abuses or oppresses a Chinaman. under any circumstances, an explanation that seems to be much needed in the East. Only the scum of the population do it, they and their children. They, and naturally and consistently the policemen and politicians likewise, for these are the dust-licking pimps and slaves of the scum, there as well as elsewhere in America. End of chapter 54.
This is chapter 55 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, chapter 55.
I began to get tired of staying in one place so long. There was no longer satisfying variety in going down to Carson to report the proceedings of the legislature once a year, and horse races and pumpkin shows once in 3 months. They had to go raising pumpkins and potatoes in Washoe Valley, and of course one of the first achievements of the legislature was to institute a $10,000 agricultural fair to show off $40 worth of those pumpkins in. However, the territorial legislature was usually spoken of as the asylum. I wanted to see San Francisco. I wanted to go somewhere. I did not know what I wanted. I had the spring fever, and wanted a change principally, no doubt. Besides, a convention had framed a state constitution. 9 men out of every 10 wanted an office. I believed that these gentlemen would treat the moneyless and the irresponsible among the population into adopting the Constitution and thus well nigh killing the country. It could not well carry such a load as a state government, since it had nothing to tax that could stand a tax, for undeveloped minds could not, and there were not 50 developed ones in the land. There was but little realty to tax, and it did seem as if nobody was ever going to think of the simple salvation of inflicting a money penalty on murder. I believed that a state government would destroy the flush times, and I wanted to get away. I believed that the mining stocks I had on hand would soon be worth $100,000, and thought if they reached that before the Constitution was adopted, I would sell out and make myself secure from the crash the change of government was going to bring. I considered $100,000 sufficient to go home with decently, though it was but a small amount compared to what I had been expecting to return with. I felt rather downhearted about it, but I tried to comfort myself with the reflection that with such a sum I could not fall into want. About this time a schoolmate of mine, whom I had not seen since boyhood, came tramping in on foot from the Reese River, a very allegory of poverty. The son of wealthy parents, here he was, in a strange land, hungry, bootless, mantled in an ancient horse blanket, roofed with a brimless hat, and so generally and so extravagantly dilapidated that he could have taken the shine out of the prodigal son himself, as he pleasantly remarked. He wanted to borrow $46, 26 to take him to San Francisco, and 20 for something else, to buy some soap with, maybe, for he needed it. I found I had but little more than the amount wanted in my pocket, so I stepped in and borrowed $46 of a banker on 20 days' time, without the formality of a note, and gave it him, rather than walk half a block to the office, where I had some specie laid up. If anybody had told me that it would take me 2 years to pay back that $46 to the banker, for I did not expect it of the prodigal and was not disappointed, I would have felt injured, and so would the banker. I wanted a change. I wanted variety of some kind. It came. Mr. Goodman went away for a week and left me the post of chief editor. It destroyed me. The first day I wrote my leader in the forenoon. The second day I had no subject and put it off till the afternoon. The third day I put it off till evening, and then copied an elaborate editorial out of the American Cyclopedia, that steadfast friend of the editor, all over this land. The fourth day I fooled around till midnight, and then fell back on the Cyclopedia again. The fifth day I cudgeled my brain till midnight, and then kept the press waiting while I penned some bitter personalities on 6 different people. The sixth day I labored in anguish till far into the night, and brought forth nothing. The paper went to press without an editorial. The 7th day I resigned.
On the 8th, Mr. Goodman returned and found 6 duels on his hands. My personalities had borne fruit. Nobody, except he has tried it, knows what it is to be an editor. It is easy to scribble local rubbish, with the facts all before you. It is easy to clip selections from other papers. It is easy to string out a correspondence from any locality. But it is unspeakable hardship to write editorials. Subjects are the trouble. The dreary lack of them, I mean. Every day it is drag, drag, drag. Think and worry and suffer, all the world is a dull blank, and yet the editorial columns must be filled. Only give the editor a subject, and his work is done. It is no trouble to write it up, but fancy how you would feel if you had to pump your brains dry every day in the week, 52 weeks in the year. It makes one low-spirited simply to think of it. The matter that each editor of a daily paper in America writes in the course of a year would fill from 4 to 8 bulky volumes like this book. Fancy what a library an editor's work would make, after 20 or 30 years' service. Yet people often marvel that Dickens, Scott, Bulwer, Dumas, etc., have been able to produce so many books. If these authors had wrought as voluminously as newspaper editors do, the result would be something to marvel at indeed. How editors can continue this tremendous labor, this exhausting consumption of brain fiber, for their work is creative and not a mere mechanical laying up of facts like reporting, day after day and year after year, is incomprehensible. Preachers take 2 months' holiday in midsummer, for they find that to produce 2 sermons a week is wearing in the long run. In truth it must be so, and is so. And therefore, how an editor can take from 10 to 20 texts and build upon them from 10 to 20 painstaking editorials a week, and keep it up all the year round, is farther beyond comprehension than ever. Ever since I survived my week as editor, I have found at least one pleasure in any newspaper that comes to my hand. It is in admiring the long columns of editorial, and wondering to myself how in the mischief he did it. Mr. Goodman's return relieved me of employment, unless I chose to become a reporter again. I could not do that. I could not serve in the ranks after being general of the army, so I thought I would depart and go abroad into the world somewhere. Just at this juncture, Dan, my associate in the reportorial department, told me, casually, that 2 citizens had been trying to persuade him to go with them to New York and aid in selling a rich silver mine which they had discovered and secured in a new mining district in our neighborhood. He said they offered to pay his expenses and give him 1/3 of the proceeds of the sale. He had refused to go. It was the very opportunity I wanted. I abused him for keeping so quiet about it and not mentioning it sooner. He said it had not occurred to him that I would like to go, and so he had recommended them to apply to Marshall, the reporter of the other paper. I asked Dan if it was a good, honest mine and no swindle. He said the men had shown him 9 tons of the rock which they had got out to take to New York, and he could cheerfully say that he had seen but little rock in Nevada that was richer, and, moreover, he said that they had secured a tract of valuable timber and a mill site near the mine. My first idea was to kill Dan, but I changed my mind, notwithstanding I was so angry, for I thought maybe the chance was not yet lost. Dan said it was by no means lost, that the men were absent at the mine again, and would not be in Virginia to leave for the East for some 10 days, that they had requested him to do the talking to Marshall, and he had promised that he would either secure Marshall or somebody else for them by the time they got back. He would now say nothing to anybody till they returned, and then fulfill his promise by furnishing me to them. It was splendid. I went to bed all on fire with excitement, for nobody had yet gone east to sell a Nevada silver mine, and the field was white for the sickle. I felt that such a mine as the one described by Dan would bring a princely sum in New York and sell without delay or difficulty. I could not sleep, my fancy so rioted through its castles in the air. It was the blind lead come again. Next day I got away on the coach, with the usual éclat attending departures of old citizens, for if you have only half a dozen friends out there, they will make noise for 100 rather than let you seem to go away neglected and unregretted, and Dan promised to keep strict watch for the men that had the mine to sell. The trip was signalized, but by one little incident, and that occurred just as we were about to start. A very seedy-looking vagabond passenger got out of the stage a moment to wait till the usual ballast of silver bricks was thrown in. He was standing on the pavement when an awkward express employee carrying a brick weighing 100 pounds stumbled and let it fall on the bummer's foot. He instantly dropped on the ground and began to howl in the most heart-breaking way. A sympathizing crowd gathered around and were going to pull his boot off, but he screamed louder than ever, and they desisted. Then he fell to gasping, and between the gasps ejaculated, "Brandy! For heaven's sake, brandy!" They poured half a pint down him, and it wonderfully restored and comforted him. Then he begged the people to assist him to the stage, which was done. The express people urged him to have a doctor at their expense, but he declined, and said that if he only had a little brandy to take along with him to soothe his paroxysms of pain when they came on, he would be grateful and content. He was quickly supplied with 2 bottles, and we drove off. He was so smiling and happy after that that I could not refrain from asking him how he could possibly be so comfortable with a crushed foot. "Well," he said, "I hadn't had a drink for 12 hours, and hadn't a cent to my name. I was most perishing, and so when that duffer dropped that 100-pounder on my foot, I see my chance. Got a cork leg, you know." And he pulled up his pantaloons and proved it. He was as drunk as a lord all day long, and full of chucklings over his timely ingenuity. One drunken man necessarily reminds one of another. I once heard a gentleman tell about an incident which he witnessed in a Californian bar-room. He entitled it, "Ye Modest Man Taketh a Drink." It was nothing but a bit of acting, but it seemed to me a perfect rendering, and worthy of Toodles himself. The modest man, tolerably far gone with beer and other matters, enters a saloon. 25 cents is the price for anything and everything, and specie the only money used, and lays down half a dollar. Calls for whiskey and drinks it. The barkeeper makes change and lays the quarter in a wet place on the counter. The modest man fumbles at it with nerveless fingers, but it slips and the water holds it. He contemplates it and tries again. Same result. Observes that people are interested in what he is at, and blushes. Fumbles at the quarter again, blushes, puts his forefinger carefully, slowly down, to make sure of his aim, pushes the coin toward the barkeeper, and says, with a sigh, "Give me a cigar." Naturally, another gentleman present told about another drunken man. He said he reeled toward home late at night, made a mistake, and entered the wrong gate. Thought he saw a dog on the stoop, and it was, an iron one. He stopped and considered, wondered if it was a dangerous dog, ventured to say, "Begone!" No effect. Then he approached warily, and adopted conciliation, pursed up his lips and tried to whistle, but failed, still approached, saying, "Poor dog, doggy, 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 poor doggy dog." Got up on the stoop, still petting with fond names, till master of the advantages, then exclaimed, "Leave, you thief!" planted a vindictive kick in his ribs, and went head over heels overboard, of course. A pause, a sigh or two of pain, and then a remark in a reflective voice, "Awful solid dog. What could he been eating?" "Rocks, perhaps. Such animals is dangerous." "That's what I say. They're dangerous. If a man wants to feed a dog on rocks, let him feed him on rocks. It's all right. But let him keep him at home, not have him laying round promiscuous where people's liable to stumble over him when they ain't noticing." It was not without regret that I took a last look at the tiny flag. It was 35 feet long and 10 feet wide, fluttering like a lady's handkerchief from the topmost peak of Mount Davidson, 2,000 feet above Virginia's roofs, and felt that doubtless I was bidding a permanent farewell to a city which had afforded me the most vigorous enjoyment of life I had ever experienced. And this reminds me of an incident which the dullest memory Virginia could boast at the time it happened must vividly recall, at times, till its possessor dies. Late one summer afternoon we had a rain shower. That was astonishing enough in itself to set the whole town buzzing, for it only rains, during a week or 2 weeks, in the winter in Nevada, and even then not enough at a time to make it worth while for any merchant to keep umbrellas for sale. But the rain was not the chief wonder. It only lasted 5 or 10 minutes. While the people were still talking about it, all the heavens gathered to themselves a dense blackness as of midnight. All the vast eastern front of Mount Davidson, overlooking the city, put on such a funereal gloom that only the nearness and solidity of the mountain made its outlines even faintly distinguishable from the dead blackness of the heavens they rested against. This unaccustomed sight turned all eyes toward the mountain, and as they looked, a little tongue of rich golden flame was seen waving and quivering in the heart of the midnight, away up on the extreme summit. In a few minutes the streets were packed with people, gazing with hardly an uttered word at the one brilliant mote in the brooding world of darkness. It flicked like a candle flame, and looked no larger, but with such a background it was wonderfully bright, small as it was. It was the flag. Though no one suspected at first, it seemed so like a supernatural visitor of some kind, a mysterious messenger of good tidings, some were fain to believe. It was the nation's emblem, transfigured by the departing rays of a sun that was entirely palled from view, and on no other object did the glory fall in all the broad panorama of mountain ranges and deserts, not even upon the staff of the flag, for that, a needle in the distance at any time, was now untouched by the light and undistinguishable in the gloom. For a whole hour the weird visitor winked and burned in its lofty solitude, and still the thousands of uplifted eyes watched it with fascinated interest. How the people were wrought up! The superstition grew apace that this was a mystic courier come with great news from the war, the poetry of the idea excusing and commending it, and on it spread, from heart to heart, from lip to lip, and from street to street, till there was a general impulse to have out the military and welcome the bright waif with a salvo of artillery. And all that time one sorely tried man, the telegraph operator, sworn to official secrecy, had to lock his lips and chain his tongue with a silence that was like to rend them, for he, and he only, of all the speculating multitude, knew the great things this sinking sun had seen that day in the east, Vicksburg fallen, and the Union arms victorious at Gettysburg. But for the journalistic monopoly that forbade the slightest revealment of Eastern news till a day after its publication in the California papers, the glorified flag on Mount Davidson would have been saluted and resaluted that memorable evening as long as there was a charge of powder to thunder with. The city would have been illuminated, and every man that had any respect for himself would have got drunk, as was the custom of the country on all occasions of public moment. Even at this distant day I cannot think of this needlessly marred supreme opportunity without regret. What a time we might have had! End of chapter 55. This is chapter 56 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, chapter 56. We rumbled over the plains and valleys, climbed the Sierras to the clouds, and looked down upon summer-clad California. I will remark here, in passing, that all scenery in California requires distance to give it its highest charm. The mountains are imposing in their sublimity and their majesty of form and altitude, from any point of view, but one must have distance to soften their ruggedness and enrich their tintings. A Californian forest is best at a little distance, for there is a sad poverty of variety in species, the trees being chiefly of one monotonous family, redwood, pine, spruce, fir, and so, at a near view, there is a wearisome sameness of attitude in their rigid arms, stretched downward and outward in one continued and reiterated appeal to all men to "Shh, don't say a word, you might disturb somebody." Close at hand, too, there is a reliefless and relentless smell of pitch and turpentine. There is a ceaseless melancholy in their sighing and complaining foliage. One walks over a soundless carpet of beaten yellow bark and dead spines of the foliage till he feels like a wandering spirit bereft of a footfall. He tires of the endless tufts of needles and yearns for substantial, shapely leaves. He looks for moss and grass to loll upon, and finds none. For where there is no bark, there is naked clay and dirt, enemies to pensive musing and clean apparel. Often a grassy plain in California is what it should be, but often, too, it is best contemplated at a distance, because although its grass blades are tall, they stand up vindictively straight and self-sufficient, and are unsociably wide apart, with uncomely spots of barren sand between. One of the queerest things I know of is to hear tourists from the States go into ecstasies over the loveliness of ever-blooming California, and they always do go into that sort of ecstasies, but perhaps they would modify them if they knew how old Californians, with the memory full upon them of the dust-covered and questionable summer greens of Californian verdure, stand astonished and filled with worshipping admiration in the presence of the lavish richness, the brilliant green, the infinite freshness, the spendthrift variety of form and species and foliage that make an Eastern landscape a vision of paradise itself. The idea of a man falling into raptures over grave and somber California, when that man has seen New England's meadow expanses and her maples, oaks, and cathedral-windowed elms decked in summer attire, or the opaline splendors of autumn descending upon her forests, comes very near being funny. Would be, in fact, but that it is so pathetic. No land with an unvarying climate can be very beautiful. The tropics are not, for all the sentiment that is wasted on them. They seem beautiful at first, but sameness impairs the charm by and by. Change is the handmaiden Nature requires to do her miracles with. The land that has 4 well-defined seasons cannot lack beauty, or pall with monotony. Each season brings a world of enjoyment and interest in the watching of its unfolding, its gradual, harmonious development, its culminating graces, and just as one begins to tire of it, it passes away, and a radical change comes, with new witcheries and new glories in its train. And I think, to one in sympathy with nature, each season, in its turn, seems the loveliest. San Francisco, a truly fascinating city to live in, is stately and handsome at a fair distance. But close at hand one notes that the architecture is mostly old-fashioned. Many streets are made up of decaying, smoke-grimed wooden houses, and the barren sand hills toward the outskirts obtrude themselves too prominently. Even the kindly climate is sometimes pleasanter when read about than personally experienced, for a lovely cloudless sky wears out its welcome by, and then, when the longed-for rain does come, it stays. Even the playful earthquake is better contemplated at a However, there are varying opinions about that. The climate of San Francisco is mild and singularly equable. The thermometer stands at about 70 degrees the year round. It hardly changes at all. You sleep under 1 or 2 light blankets, summer and winter, and never use a mosquito bar. Nobody ever wears summer clothing. You wear black broadcloth, if you have it, in August and January, just the same. It is no colder and no warmer in the one month than the other. You do not use overcoats, and you do not use fans. It is as pleasant a climate as could well be contrived, take it all around, and is doubtless the most unvarying in the whole world. The wind blows there a good deal in the summer months, but then you can go over to Oakland if you choose, 3 or 4 miles away. It does not blow there. It has only snowed twice in San Francisco in 19 years, and then it only remained on the ground long enough to astonish the children and set them to wondering what the feathery stuff was. During 8 months of the year, straight along, the skies are bright and cloudless, and never a drop of rain falls. But when the other 4 months come along, you will need to go and steal an umbrella, because you will require it. Not just one day, but 120 days in hardly varying succession. When you want to go visiting, or attend church, or the theater, You never look up at the clouds to see whether it is likely to rain or not. You look at the almanac. If it is winter, it will rain; and if it is summer, it won't rain, and you cannot help it. You never need a lightning rod, because it never thunders, and it never lightens. And after you have listened for 6 or 8 weeks every night to the dismal monotony of those quiet rains, you will wish in your heart the thunder would leap and crash and roar along those drowsy skies once, and make everything alive. You will wish the prisoned lightnings would cleave the dull firmament asunder, and light it with a blinding glare for one little instant. You would give anything to hear the old familiar thunder again, and see the lightning strike somebody. And along in the summer, when you have suffered about 4 months of lustrous, pitiless sunshine, you are ready to go down on your knees and plead for rain, hail, snow, thunder and lightning, anything to break the monotony. You will take an earthquake if you cannot do any better, and the chances are that you'll get it, too. San Francisco is built on sand hills, but they are prolific sand hills. They yield a generous vegetation. All the rare flowers which people in the States rear with such patient care in parlor flower pots and greenhouses flourish luxuriantly in the open air there all the year round. Calla lilies, all sorts of geraniums, passion flowers, moss roses, I do not know the names of a tenth part of them. I only know that while New Yorkers are burdened with banks and drifts of snow, Californians are burdened with banks and drifts of flowers, if they only keep their hands off and let them grow. And I have heard that they have also that rarest and most curious of all the flowers, the beautiful Espiritu Santo, as the Spaniards call it, or flower of the Holy Spirit, though I thought it grew only in Central America, down on the Isthmus. In its cup is the daintiest little facsimile of a dove, as pure as snow. The Spaniards have a superstitious reverence for it. The blossom has been conveyed to the States, submerged in ether, and the bulb has been taken thither also, but every attempt to make it bloom after it arrived has failed. I have elsewhere spoken of the endless winter of Mono, California, and but this moment of the eternal spring of San Francisco. Now, if we travel 100 miles in a straight line, we come to the eternal summer of Sacramento. One never sees summer clothing or mosquitoes in San Francisco, but they can be found in Sacramento. Not always and unvaryingly, but about 143 months out of 12 years, perhaps. Flowers bloom there, always, the reader can easily believe. People suffer and sweat and swear morning, noon, and night, and wear out their staunchest energies fanning themselves. It gets hot there, but if you go down to Fort Yuma, you will find it hotter. Fort Yuma is probably the hottest place on earth. The thermometer stays at 120 in the shade there all the time, except when it varies and goes higher. It is a U.S. military post, and its occupants get so used to the terrific heat that they suffer without it. There is a tradition, attributed to John Phoenix, it has been purloined by 50 different scribblers who were too poor to invent a fancy but not ashamed to steal one. M.T. That a very, very wicked soldier died there once, and of course went straight to the hottest corner of perdition, and the next day he telegraphed back for his blankets. There is no doubt about the truth of this statement. There can be no doubt about it. I have seen the place where that soldier used to board. In Sacramento it is fiery summer always, and you can gather roses and eat strawberries and ice cream and wear white linen clothes and pant and perspire at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and then take the cars and at noon put on your furs and your skates and go skimming over frozen Donner Lake, 7,000 feet above the valley, among snowbanks 15 feet deep, and in the shadow of grand mountain peaks that lift their frosty crags 10,000 feet above the level of the sea. There is a transition for you. Where will you find another like it in the Western Hemisphere? And some of us have swept around snow-walled curves of the Pacific Railroad in that vicinity 6,000 feet above the sea, and looked down, as the birds do, upon the deathless summer of the Sacramento Valley, with its fruitful fields, its feathery foliage, its silver streams, all slumbering in the mellow haze of its enchanted atmosphere, and all infinitely softened and spiritualized by distance. a dreamy, exquisite glimpse of fairyland, made all the more charming and striking that it was caught through a forbidden gateway of ice and snow and savage crags and precipices. End of chapter 56. This is chapter 57 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 57. It was in this Sacramento Valley, just referred to, that a deal of the most lucrative of the early gold mining was done, and you may still see, in places, its grassy slopes and levels torn and guttered and disfigured by the avaricious spoilers of 15 and 20 years ago. You may see such disfigurements far and wide over California, and in some such places where only meadows and forests are visible, not a living creature, not a house, no stick or stone or remnant of a ruin, and not a sound, not even a whisper, to disturb the Sabbath stillness. You will find it hard to believe that there stood at one time a fiercely flourishing little city of 2,000 or 3,000 souls, with its newspaper, fire company, brass band, volunteer militia, bank, hotels, noisy Fourth of July processions and speeches, gambling hells crammed with tobacco smoke, profanity, and rough-bearded men of all nations and colors, with tables heaped with gold dust sufficient for the revenues of a German principality, streets crowded and rife with business, town lots worth $400 a front foot, labor, laughter, music, dancing, swearing, fighting, shooting, stabbing, a bloody inquest and a man for breakfast every morning, everything that delights and adorns existence, all the appointments and appurtenances of a thriving and prosperous and promising young city. And now nothing is left of it all but a lifeless, homeless solitude. The men are gone, the houses have vanished, even the name of the place is forgotten. In no other land in modern times have towns so absolutely died and disappeared as in the old mining regions of California. It was a driving, vigorous, restless population in those days. It was a curious population. It was the only population of the kind that the world has ever seen gathered together, and it is not likely that the world will ever see its like again. For, observe, it was an assemblage of 200,000 young men, not simpering, dainty, kid-gloved weaklings, but stalwart, muscular, dauntless young braves, brimful of push and energy, and royally endowed with every attribute that goes to make up a peerless and magnificent manhood, the very pick and choice of the world's glorious ones. No women, no children, no gray and stooping veterans, none but erect, bright-eyed, quick-moving, strong-handed young giants, the strangest population, the finest population, the most gallant host that ever trooped down the startled solitudes of an unpeopled land. And where are they now? Scattered to the ends of the earth, or prematurely aged and decrepit, or shot or stabbed in street affrays, or dead of disappointed hopes and broken hearts, all gone, or nearly all, victims devoted upon the altar of the golden calf, the noblest holocaust that ever wafted its sacrificial incense heavenward. It is pitiful to think upon. It was a splendid population, for all the slow, sleepy, sluggish-brained sloths stayed at home. You never find that sort of people among pioneers. You cannot build pioneers out of that sort of material. It was that population that gave to California a name for getting up astounding enterprises and rushing them through with a magnificent dash and daring and a recklessness of cost or consequences, which she bears unto this day. And when she projects a new surprise, the grave world smiles as usual and says, well, that is California all over. But they were rough in those times. They fairly reveled in gold, whiskey, fights, and fandangos, and were unspeakably happy. The honest miner raked from $100 to $1,000 out of his claim a day, and what with the gambling dens and the other entertainments, he hadn't a cent the next morning, if he had any sort of luck. They cooked their own bacon and beans, sewed on their own buttons, washed their own shirts, blue woolen ones, and if a man wanted a fight on his hands without any annoying delay, all he had to do was to appear in public in a white shirt or a stove-pipe hat, and he would be accommodated. For those people hated aristocrats. They had a particular and malignant animosity toward what they called a biled shirt. It was a wild, free, disorderly, grotesque society. Men, only swarming hosts of stalwart men, nothing juvenile, nothing feminine, visible anywhere. In those days miners would flock in crowds to catch a glimpse of that rare and blessed spectacle, a woman. Old inhabitants tell how, in a certain camp, the news went abroad early in the morning that a woman was come. They had seen a calico dress hanging out of a wagon down at the camping ground, sign of emigrants from over the Great Plains. Everybody went down there, and a shout went up when an actual bona fide dress was discovered fluttering in the wind. The male emigrant was visible. The miners said, "Fetch her out." He said, "It is my wife, gentlemen. She is sick. We have been robbed of money, provisions, everything, by the Indians. We want to rest." "Fetch her out. We've got to see her." "But, gentlemen, the poor thing, she—" "Fetch her out." He fetched her out, and they swung their hats and sent up 3 rousing cheers and a tiger, and they crowded around and gazed at her and touched her dress and listened to her voice with the look of men who listen to a memory rather than a present reality, and then they collected $2,500 in gold and gave it to the man, and swung their hats again and gave 3 more cheers and went home satisfied. Once I dined in San Francisco with the family of a pioneer, and talked with his daughter, a young lady whose first experience in San Francisco was an adventure, though she herself did not remember it, as she was only 2 or 3 years old at the time. Her father said that after landing from the ship they were walking up the street, a servant leading the party with the little girl in her arms, and presently a huge miner, bearded, belted, spurred, and bristling with deadly weapons, just down from a long campaign in the mountains, evidently barred the way, stopped the servant, and stood gazing, with a face all alive with gratification and astonishment. And then he said reverently, "Well, if it ain't a child!" And then he snatched a little leather sack out of his pocket and said to the servant, "There's $150 in dust there, and I'll give it to you to let me kiss the child." That anecdote is true. But see how things change. Sitting at that dinner table, listening to that anecdote, if I had offered double the money for the privilege of kissing the same child, I would have been refused. 17 added years have far more than doubled the price. And, while upon this subject, I will remark that once in Star City, in the Humboldt Mountains, I took my place in a sort of long post-office single file of miners, to patiently await my chance to peep through a crack in the cabin and get a sight of the splendid new sensation, a genuine live woman. And at the end of half an hour my turn came, and I put my eye to the crack, and there she was, with one arm akimbo, and tossing flapjacks in a frying-pan with the other. And she was 165. Being in calmer mood now, I voluntarily knock off 100 from that. M.T. years old, and hadn't a tooth in her head. End of chapter 57. This is chapter 58 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 58. For a few months I enjoyed what to me was an entirely new phase of existence, a butterfly idleness. Nothing to do, nobody to be responsible to, and untroubled with financial uneasiness. I fell in love with the most cordial and sociable city in the Union. After the sagebrush and alkali deserts of Washoe, San Francisco was paradise to me. I lived at the best hotel, exhibited my clothes in the most conspicuous places, infested the opera, and learned to seem enraptured with music which oftener afflicted my ignorant ear than enchanted it, if I had had the vulgar honesty to confess it. However, I suppose I was not greatly worse than the most of my countrymen in that. I had longed to be a butterfly, and I was one at last. I attended private parties in sumptuous evening dress, simpered and aired my graces like a born beau, and polkaed and schottished with a step peculiar to myself and the kangaroo. In a word, I kept the due state of a man worth $100,000 prospectively, and likely to reach absolute affluence when that silver mine sale should be ultimately achieved in the East. I spent money with a free hand, and meantime watched the stock sales with an interested eye and looked to see what might happen in Nevada. Something very important happened. The property holders of Nevada voted against the state constitution, but the folks who had nothing to lose were in the majority and carried the measure over their heads. But after all, it did not immediately look like a disaster, though unquestionably it was one. I hesitated, calculated the chances, and then concluded not to sell. Stocks went on rising, speculation went mad. Bankers, merchants, lawyers, doctors, mechanics, laborers, even the very washerwomen and servant girls, were putting up their earnings on silver stocks, and every sun that rose in the morning went down on paupers enriched and rich men beggared. What a gambling carnival it was! Gould and Curry soared to $6,300 a foot, and then, all of a sudden, out went the bottom, and everything and everybody went to ruin and destruction. The wreck was complete. The bubble scarcely left a microscopic moisture behind it. I was an early beggar, and a thorough one. My hoarded stocks were not worth the paper they were printed on. I threw them all away. I, the cheerful idiot that had been squandering money like water, and thought myself beyond the reach of misfortune, had not now as much as $50 when I gathered together my various debts and paid them. I removed from the hotel to a very private boarding-house. I took a reporter's berth and went to work. I was not entirely broken in spirit, for I was building confidently on the sale of the silver mine in the East. But I could not hear from Dan. My letters miscarried or were not answered. One day I did not feel vigorous and remained away from the office. The next day I went down toward noon as usual and found a note on my desk which had been there 24 hours. It was signed Marshall, the Virginia reporter, and contained a request that I should call at the hotel and see him and a friend or two that night, as they would sail for the East in the morning. A postscript added that their errand was a big mining speculation. I was hardly ever so sick in my life. I abused myself for leaving Virginia and entrusting to another man a matter I ought to have attended to myself. I abused myself for remaining away from the office on the one day of all the year that I should have been there. And thus, berating myself, I trotted a mile to the steamer wharf and arrived just in time to be late. The ship was in the stream and under way. I comforted myself with the thought that maybe the speculation would amount to nothing, poor comfort at best, and then went back to my slavery, resolved to put up with my $35 a week and forget all about it. A month afterward I enjoyed my first earthquake. It was one which was long called the Great Earthquake, and is doubtless so distinguished till this day. It was just after noon, on a bright October day. I was coming down 3rd Street, the only objects in motion anywhere in sight in that thickly built and populous quarter were a man in a buggy behind me, and a street-car wending slowly up the cross-street. Otherwise all was solitude and a Sabbath stillness. As I turned the corner around a frame house, there was a great rattle and jar, and it occurred to me that here was an item. No doubt a fight in that house. Before I could turn and seek the door, there came a really terrific shock. The ground seemed to roll under me in waves, interrupted by a violent joggling up and down, and there was a heavy grinding noise, as of brick houses rubbing together. I fell up against the frame house and hurt my elbow. I knew what it was now, and from mere repertorial instinct, nothing else, I took out my watch and noted the time of day. At that moment a third and still severer shock came, and as I reeled about on the pavement trying to keep my footing, I saw a sight. The entire front of a tall 4-story brick building in 3rd Street sprung outward like a door and fell sprawling across the street, raising a dust like a great volume of smoke. And here came the buggy, overboard went the man, and in less time than I can tell it the vehicle was distributed in small fragments along 300 yards of the street.
One could have fancied that somebody had fired a charge of chair rounds and rags down the thoroughfare. The street car had stopped. The horses were rearing and plunging. The passengers were pouring out at both ends, and one fat man had crashed halfway through a glass window on one side of the car, got wedged fast, and was squirming and screaming like an impaled madman. Every door of every house, as far as the eye could reach, was vomiting a stream of human beings, and almost before one could execute a wink and begin another, there was a massed multitude of people stretching in endless procession down every street my position commanded. Never was solemn solitude turned into teeming life quicker. Of the wonders wrought by the great earthquake, these were all that came under my eye, but the tricks it did elsewhere, and far and wide over the town, made toothsome gossip for 9 days. The destruction of property was trifling. The injury to it was widespread and somewhat serious. The curiosities of the earthquake were simply endless. Gentlemen and ladies who were sick, or were taking a siesta, or had dissipated till a late hour, and were making up lost sleep, thronged into the public streets in all sorts of queer apparel, and some without any at all. One woman, who had been washing a naked child, ran down the street holding it by the ankles as if it were a dressed turkey. Prominent citizens, who were supposed to keep the Sabbath strictly, rushed out of saloons in their shirt-sleeves with billiard cues in their hands. Dozens of men with necks swathed in napkins rushed from barber shops, lathered to the eyes, or with one cheek clean-shaved and the other still bearing a hairy stubble. Horses broke from stables, and a frightened dog rushed up a short attic ladder and out onto a roof, and when his scare was over, had not the nerve to go down again the same way he had gone up. A prominent editor flew downstairs in the principal hotel with nothing on but one brief undergarment, met a chambermaid, and exclaimed, "Oh, what shall I do? Where shall I go?" She responded with naive serenity, "If you have no choice, you might try a clothing store." A certain foreign consul's lady was the acknowledged leader of fashion, and every time she appeared in anything new or extraordinary, the ladies in the vicinity made a raid on their husbands' purses and arrayed themselves similarly. One man who had suffered considerably and growled accordingly was standing at the window when the shocks came, and the next instant the consul's wife, just out of the bath, fled by with no other apology for clothing than a bath-towel. The sufferer rose superior to the terrors of the earthquake, and said to his wife, "Now that is something like! Get out your towel, my dear." The plastering that fell from ceilings in San Francisco that day would have covered several acres of ground. For some days afterward groups of eyeing and pointing men stood about many a building, looking at long zigzag cracks that extended from the eaves to the ground. 4 feet of the tops of 3 chimneys on one house were broken square off and turned around in such a way as to completely stop the draft. A crack 100 feet long gaped open 6 inches wide in the middle of one street, and then shut together again with such force as to ridge up the meeting earth like a slender grave. A lady, sitting in her rocking and quaking parlor, saw the wall part at the ceiling, open and shut twice, like a mouth, and then drop the end of a brick on the floor like a tooth. She was a woman easily disgusted with foolishness, and she arose and went out of there. One lady who was coming downstairs was astonished to see a bronze Hercules lean forward on its pedestal as if to strike her with its club. They both reached the bottom of the flight at the same time, the woman insensible from the fright. Her child, born some little time afterward, was club-footed. However, on second thought, if the reader sees any coincidence in this, he must do it at his own risk. The first shock brought down 2 or 3 huge organ pipes in one of the churches. The minister, with uplifted hands, was just closing the services. He glanced up, hesitated, and said, "However, we will omit the benediction," and the next instant there was a vacancy in the atmosphere where he had stood. After the first shock, an Oakland minister said, "Keep your seats, there is no better place to die than this," and added, after the third, "But outside is good enough," and then he skipped out the back door. Such another destruction of mantel ornaments and toilet bottles as the earthquake created, San Francisco never saw before. There was hardly a girl or a matron in the city but suffered losses of this kind.
Suspended pictures were thrown down, but oftener still, by a curious freak of the earthquake's humor, they were whirled completely around with their faces to the wall. There was great difference of opinion at first as to the course or direction the earthquake traveled, but water that splashed out of various tanks and buckets settled that. Thousands of people were made so seasick by the rolling and pitching of floors and streets that they were weak and bedridden for hours, and some few for even days afterward. Hardly an individual escaped nausea entirely. The queer earthquake, episodes that formed the staple of San Francisco gossip for the next week, would fill a much larger book than this, and so I will diverge from the subject. By and by, in the due course of things, I picked up a copy of the Enterprise one day, and fell under this cruel blow: Nevada Mines in New York. G. M. Marshall, Sheba Hurs, and Amos H. Rose, who left San Francisco last July for New York City with ores from mines in Pinewood District, Humboldt County, and on the Reese River Range, have disposed of a mine containing 6,000 feet and called the Pine Mountains Consolidated, for the sum of $3,000,000. The stamps on the deed, which is now on its way to Humboldt County from New York for record, amounted to $3,000, which is said to be the largest amount of stamps ever placed on one document. A working capital of $1,000,000 has been paid into the Treasury, and machinery has already been purchased for a large quartz mill, which will be put up as soon as possible. The stock in this company is all full paid and entirely unaccessible. The ores of the mines in this district somewhat resemble those of the Sheba mine in Humboldt. Sheba Hurst, the discoverer of the mines, with his friends, corralled all the best leads and all the land and timber they desired before making public their whereabouts. Ores from there, assayed in this city, showed them to be exceedingly rich in silver and gold, silver predominating. There is an abundance of wood and water in the district. We are glad to know that New York capital has been enlisted in the development of the mines of this region. Having seen the ores and assays, we are satisfied that the mines of the district are very valuable, anything but wildcat. Once more, native imbecility had carried the day, and I had lost $1,000,000. It was the blind lead over again. Let us not dwell on this miserable matter. If I were inventing these things, I could be wonderfully humorous over them, but they are too true to be talked of with hearty levity, even at this distant day. True, and yet not exactly as given in the above figures, possibly. I saw Marshall months afterward, and although he had plenty of money, he did not claim to have captured an entire $1,000,000. In fact, I gathered that he had not then received $50,000. Beyond that figure, his fortune appeared to consist of uncertain vast expectations rather than prodigious certainties. However, when the above item appeared in print, I put full faith in it, and incontinently wilted and went to seed under it. Suffice it that I so lost heart, and so yielded myself up to repinings and sighings and foolish regrets, that I neglected my duties and became about worthless as a reporter for a brisk newspaper. And at last one of the proprietors took me aside, with a charity I still remember with considerable respect, and gave me an opportunity to resign my berth, and so save myself the disgrace of a dismissal. End of chapter 58. This is Chapter 59 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 59. For a time I wrote literary screeds for the golden era. C. H. Webb had established a very excellent literary weekly called The Californian, but high merit was no guarantee of success. It languished, and he sold out to 3 printers, and Bret Harte became editor at $20 a week, and I was employed to contribute an article a week at $12. But the journal still languished, and the printers sold out to Captain Ogden, a rich man and a pleasant gentleman who chose to amuse himself with such an expensive luxury without much caring about the cost of it. When he grew tired of the novelty, he resold to the printers. The paper presently died a peaceful death, and I was out of work again. I would not mention these things but for the fact that they so aptly illustrate the ups and downs that characterize life on the Pacific coast. A man could hardly stumble into such a variety of queer vicissitudes in any other country. For 2 months my sole occupation was avoiding acquaintances, for during that time I did not earn a penny, or buy an article of any kind, or pay my board. I became a very adept at slinking. I slunk from back street to back street. I slunk away from approaching faces that looked familiar. I slunk to my meals, ate them humbly and with a mute apology for every mouthful I robbed my generous landlady of, and at midnight, after wanderings that were but slinkings away from cheerfulness and light, I slunk to my bed. I felt meaner and lowlier and more despicable than the worms. During all this time I had but one piece of money, a silver 10-cent piece, and I held to it and would not spend it on any account, lest the consciousness, coming strong upon me that I was entirely penniless, might suggest suicide. I had pawned everything but the clothes I had on, so I clung to my dime desperately till it was smooth with handling. However, I am forgetting. I did have one other occupation beside that of slinking. It was the entertaining of a collector, and being entertained by him, who had in his hands the Virginia banker's bill for $46 which I had loaned my schoolmate, the prodigal. This man used to call regularly once a week and dun me, and sometimes oftener. He did it from sheer force of habit, for he knew he could get nothing. He would get out his bill, calculate the interest for me at 5 per cent a month, and show me clearly that there was no attempt at fraud in it, and no mistakes, and then plead and argue and dun with all his might for any sum, any little trifle, even $1, even half $1 on account. Then his duty was accomplished and his conscience free. He immediately dropped the subject there always, got out a couple of cigars and divided, put his feet in the window, and then we would have a long, luxurious talk about everything and everybody, and he would furnish me a world of curious dunning adventures out of the ample store in his memory. By and by he would clap his hat on his head, shake hands, and say briskly, "Well, business is business, can't stay with you always," and was off in a second. The idea of pining for a dun! And yet I used to long for him to come, and would get as uneasy as any mother if the day went by without his visit, when I was expecting him. But he never collected that bill, at last, nor any part of it. I lived to pay it to the banker myself. Misery loves company. Now and then at night, in out-of-the-way, dimly lighted places, I found myself happening on another child of misfortune. He looked so seedy and forlorn, so homeless and friendless and forsaken, that I yearned toward him as a brother. I wanted to claim kinship with him, and go about and enjoy our wretchedness together. The drawing toward each other must have been mutual. At any rate, we got to falling together oftener, though still seemingly by accident, and although we did not speak or evince any recognition, I think the dull anxiety passed out of both of us when we saw each other, and then for several hours we would idle along contentedly, wide apart, and glancing furtively in at home lights and fireside gatherings, out of the night shadows, and very much enjoying our dumb companionship. Finally we spoke, and were inseparable after that, for our woes were identical, almost. He had been a reporter, too, and lost his berth, and this was his experience, as nearly as I can recollect it. After losing his berth he had gone down, 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 with never a halt, from a boarding-house on Russian Hill to a boarding-house in Kearney Street, from thence to DuPont, from thence to a low sailor den, and from thence to lodgings in goods boxes and empty hogsheads near the wharves. Then, for a while, he had gained a meager living by sewing up bursted sacks of grain on the piers. When that failed, he had found food here and there, as chance threw it in his way. He had ceased to show his face in daylight, now, for a reporter knows everybody, rich and poor, high and low, and cannot well avoid familiar faces in the broad light of day. This mendicant Blucher, I call him that for convenience, was a splendid creature. He was full of hope, pluck, and philosophy. He was well read and a man of cultivated taste.
He had a bright wit and was a master of satire. His kindliness and his generous spirit made him royal in my eyes, and changed his curbstone seat to a throne and his damaged hat to a crown. He had an adventure once which sticks fast in my memory as the most pleasantly grotesque that ever touched my sympathies. He had been without a penny for 2 months. He had shirked about obscure streets, among friendly dim lights, till the thing had become second nature to him. But at last he was driven abroad in daylight. The cause was sufficient. He had not tasted food for 48 hours, and he could not endure the misery of his hunger in idle hiding. He came along a back street, glowering at the loaves and bake-shop windows, and feeling that he could trade his life away for a morsel to eat. The sight of the bread doubled his hunger, but it was good to look at it anyhow, and imagine what one might do if one only had it. Presently, in the middle of the street, he saw a shining spot, looked again, did not and could not believe his eyes, turned away to try them, then looked again. It was a verity, no vain, hunger-inspired delusion. It was a silver dime. He snatched it, gloated over it, doubted it, bit it, found it genuine, choked his heart down, and smothered a hallelujah. Then he looked around, saw that nobody was looking at him, threw the dime down where it was before, walked away a few steps, and approached again, pretending he did not know it was there, so that he could re-enjoy the luxury of finding it. He walked around it, viewing it from different points, then sauntered about with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the signs and now and then glancing at it and feeling the old thrill again. Finally he took it up and went away, fondling it in his pocket. He idled through unfrequented streets, stopping in doorways and corners to take it out and look at it. By and by he went home to his lodgings, an empty queensware hogshead, and employed himself till night trying to make up his mind what to buy with it. But it was hard to do. To get the most for it was the idea. He knew that at the miners' restaurant he could get a plate of beans and a piece of bread for 10 cents, or a fish-ball and some few trifles, but they gave no bread with 1 fish-ball there. At French Pete's he could get a veal cutlet, plain, and some radishes and bread for 10 cents, or a cup of coffee, a pint at least, and a slice of bread, but the slice was not thick enough by the eighth of an inch, and sometimes they were still more criminal than that in the cutting of it. At 7 o'clock his hunger was wolfish, and still his mind was not made up. He turned out and went up Merchant Street, still ciphering, and chewing a bit of stick, as is the way of starving men. He passed before the lights of Martin's restaurant, the most aristocratic in the city, and stopped. It was a place where he had often dined in better days, and Martin knew him well. Standing aside, just out of the range of the light, he worshipped the quails and steaks in the show window, and imagined that maybe the fairy times were not gone yet, and some prince in disguise would come along presently and tell him to go in there and take whatever he wanted. He chewed his stick with a hungry interest as he warmed to his subject. Just at this juncture he was conscious of someone at his side, sure enough, and then a finger touched his arm. He looked up over his shoulder and saw an apparition, a very allegory of hunger. It was a man 6 feet high, gaunt, unshaven, hung with rags, with a haggard face and sunken cheeks, and eyes that pleaded piteously. This phantom said, "Come with me, please." He locked his arm in Blucher's and walked up the street to where the passengers were few and the light not strong, and then, facing about, put out his hands in a beseeching way and said, "Friend, stranger, look at me. Life is easy to you. You go about, placid and content, as I did once, in my day. You have been there, and eaten your sumptuous supper, and picked your teeth, and hummed your tune, and thought your pleasant thoughts, and said to yourself, it is a good world, but you've never suffered. You don't know what trouble is. You don't know what misery is, nor hunger. Look at me. Stranger, have pity on a poor, friendless, homeless dog. As God is my judge, I have not tasted food for 48 hours. Look in my eyes and see if I lie. Give me the least trifle in the world to keep me from starving, anything, 25 cents. Do it, stranger, do it, please.
It will be nothing to you, but life to me. Do it, and I will go down on my knees and lick the dust before you. I will kiss your footprints. I will worship the very ground you walk on. Only 25 cents. I am famishing, perishing, starving by inches. For God's sake, don't desert me." Blucher was bewildered, and touched, too, stirred to the depths. He reflected, thought again, then an idea struck him, and he said, "Come with me." He took the outcast's arm, walked him down to Martin's restaurant, seated him at a marble table, placed the bill of fare before him, and said, "Order what you want, friend. Charge it to me, Mr. Martin." "All right, Mr. Blucher," said Martin. Then Blucher stepped back and leaned against the counter and watched the man stow away cargo after cargo of buckwheat cakes at 75 cents a plate, cup after cup of coffee, and porterhouse steaks worth $2 apiece, and when $6.50 worths of destruction had been accomplished and the stranger's hunger appeased, Blucher went down to French Pete's, bought a veal cutlet plain, a slice of bread, and 3 radishes with his dime, and set to and feasted like a king. Take the episode all around, it was as odd as any that can be culled from the myriad curiosities of Californian life, perhaps. End of chapter 59. This is chapter 60 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 60. By and by, an old friend of mine, a miner, came down from one of the decayed mining camps of Tuolumne, California, and I went back with him. We lived in a small cabin on a verdant hillside, and there were not 5 other cabins in view over the wide expanse of hill and forest. Yet a flourishing city of 2,000 or 3,000 population had occupied this grassy dead solitude during the flush times of 12 or 15 years ago, and where our cabin stood had once been the heart of the teeming hive, the center of the city. When the mines gave out, the town fell into decay, and in a few years wholly disappeared, streets, dwellings, shops, everything, and left no sign. The grassy slopes were as green and smooth and desolate of life as if they had never been disturbed. The mere handful of miners still remaining had seen the town spring up, spread, grow and flourish in its pride, and they had seen it sicken and die, and pass away like a dream. With it their hopes had died, and their zest of life. They had long ago resigned themselves to their exile, and ceased to correspond with their distant friends or turn longing eyes toward their early homes. They had accepted banishment, forgotten the world, and been forgotten of the world. They were far from telegraphs and railroads, and they stood, as it were, in a living grave, dead to the events that stirred the globe's great populations, dead to the common interests of men, isolated and outcast from brotherhood with their kind. It was the most singular, and almost the most touching and melancholy exile that fancy can imagine. One of my associates in this locality, for 2 or 3 months, was a man who had had a university education, but now for 18 years he had decayed there by inches, a bearded, rough-clad, clay-stained miner, and at times, among his sighings and soliloquizing, he unconsciously interjected vaguely remembered Latin and Greek sentences, dead and musty tongues, meet vehicles for the thoughts of one whose dreams were all of the past, whose life was a failure, a tired man burdened with the present and indifferent to the future, a man without ties, hopes, interests, waiting for the rest and the end. In that one little corner of California is found a species of mining which is seldom or never mentioned in print. It is called pocket mining, and I am not aware that any of it is done outside of that little corner. The gold is not evenly distributed through the surface dirt, as in ordinary placer mines, but is collected in little spots, and they are very wide apart and exceedingly hard to find. But when you do find one, you reap a rich and sudden harvest. There are not now more than 20 pocket miners in that entire little region. I think I know every one of them personally.
I have known one of them to hunt patiently about the hillsides every day for 8 months without finding gold enough to make a snuff-box, his grocery bill running up relentlessly all the time, and then find a pocket and take out of it $2,000 in 2 dips of his shovel. I have known him to take out $3,000 in 2 hours, and go and pay up every cent of his indebtedness, then enter on a dazzling spree that finished the last of his treasure before the night was gone. And the next day he bought his groceries on credit as usual, and shouldered his pan and shovel and went off to the hills hunting pockets again, happy and content. This is the most fascinating of all the different kinds of mining, and furnishes a very handsome percentage of victims to the lunatic asylum. Pocket hunting is an ingenious process. You take a spadeful of earth from the hillside and put it in a large tin pan, and dissolve and wash it gradually away till nothing is left but a teaspoonful of fine sediment. Whatever gold was in that earth has remained because, being the heaviest, it has sought the bottom. Among the sediments you will find half a dozen yellow particles no larger than pinheads. You are delighted. You move off to one side and wash another pan. You find gold again. You move to one side further, and wash a third pan. If you find no gold this time, you are delighted again, because you know you are on the right scent. You lay an imaginary plan, shaped like a fan, with its handle up the hill. For just where the end of the handle is, you argue that the rich deposit lies hidden, whose vagrant grains of gold have escaped and been washed down the hill, spreading farther and farther apart as they wandered. And so you proceed up the hill, washing the earth and narrowing your lines every time the absence of gold in the pan shows that you are outside the spread of the fan. And at last, 20 yards up the hill, your lines have converged to a point. A single foot from that point you cannot find any gold. Your breath comes short and quick. You are feverish with excitement. The dinner bell may ring its clapper off. You pay no attention. Friends may die, weddings transpire, houses burn down. They are nothing to you. You sweat and dig and delve with a frantic interest, and all at once you strike it. Up comes a spadeful of earth and quartz that is all lovely with soiled lumps and leaves and sprays of gold. Sometimes that one spadeful is all, $500, and sometimes the nest contains $10,000, and it takes you 3 or 4 days to get it all out. The pocket miners tell of one nest that yielded $60,000, and 2 men exhausted it in 2 weeks, and then sold the ground for $10,000 to a party who never got $300 out of it afterward. The hogs are good pocket hunters. All the summer they root around the bushes and turn up 1,000 little piles of dirt, and then the miners long for the rains, for the rains beat upon these little piles and wash them down and expose the gold, possibly right over a pocket. 2 pockets were found in this way by the same man in one day. One had $5,000 in it, and the other $8,000. That man could appreciate it, for he hadn't had a cent for about a year. In Tuolumne lived 2 miners who used to go to the neighboring village in the afternoon and return every night with household supplies. Part of the distance they traversed a trail, and nearly always sat down to rest on a great boulder that lay beside the path. In the course of 13 years they had worn that boulder tolerably smooth, sitting on it. By and by 2 vagrant Mexicans came along and occupied the seat. They began to amuse themselves by chipping off flakes from the boulder with a sledge-hammer. They examined one of these flakes and found it rich with gold. That boulder paid them $800 afterward. But the aggravating circumstance was that these greasers knew that there must be more gold where that boulder came from, and so they went panning up the hill and found what was probably the richest pocket that region has yet produced. It took 3 months to exhaust it, and it yielded $120,000. The 2 American miners who used to sit on the boulder are poor yet, and they take turnabout in getting up early in the morning to curse those Mexicans. And when it comes down to pure ornamental cursing, the native American is gifted above the sons of men. I have dwelt at some length upon this matter of pocket mining because it is a subject that is seldom referred to in print, and therefore I judged that it would have for the reader that interest which naturally attaches to novelty.
End of chapter 60. This is chapter 61 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 61. One of my comrades there, another of those victims of 18 years of unrequited toil and blighted hopes, was one of the gentlest spirits that ever bore its patient cross in a weary exile. Grave and simple Dick Baker, pocket miner of Dead House Gulch. He was 46, gray as a rat, earnest, thoughtful, slenderly educated, slouchily dressed, and clay-soiled, but his heart was finer metal than any gold his shovel ever brought to light. Than any, indeed, that ever was mined or minted. Whenever he was out of luck and a little downhearted, he would fall to mourning over the loss of a wonderful cat he used to own, for where women and children are not, men of kindly impulses take up with pets, for they must love something, and he always spoke of the strange sagacity of that cat with the air of a man who believed in his secret heart that there was something human about it, maybe even supernatural. I heard him talking about this animal once. He said, "Gentlemen, I used to have a cat here by the name of Tom Quartz, which you'd took an interest in, I reckon. Most anybody would. I had him here 8 year, and he was the remarkablest cat I ever see. He was a large gray one of the Tom specie, and he had more hard, natural sense than any man in this camp, and a power of dignity. He wouldn't let the governor of California be familiar with him. He never ketched a rat in his life, 'peared to be above it. He never cared for nothing but mining. He knowed more about mining, that cat did, than any man I ever see. You couldn't tell him nothing about placer diggin's, and as for pocket mining, why, he was just born for it. He would dig out after me and Jim when we went over the hills prospecting, and he would trot along behind us for as much as 5 mile, if we went so fur. And he had the best judgment about mining ground. Why, you never see anything like it. When we went to work, he'd scatter a glance around, and if he didn't think much of the indications, he would give a look as much to say, 'Well, I'll have to get you to excuse me,' and without another word, he'd hist his nose into the air and shove for home. But if the ground suited him, he would lay low and keep dark till the first pan was washed, and then he would sidle up and take a look, and if there was about 6 or 7 grains of gold he was satisfied. He didn't want no better prospect than that. And then he would lie down on our coats and snore like a steamboat till we'd struck the pocket, and then get up and superintend. He was nearly lightning on superintending. Well, by and by, up comes this yer quartz excitement. Everybody was into it. Everybody was picking and blasting instead of shoveling dirt on the hillside. Everybody was putting down a shaft instead of scraping the surface. Nothing would do Jim but we must tackle the ledges too, and so we did. We commenced putting down a shaft, and Tom Quartz he began to wonder what in the dickens it was all about. He hadn't ever seen any mining like that before, and he was all upset, as you may say. He couldn't come to a right understanding of it no way. It was too many for him. He was down on it, too, you bet you. He was down on it powerful, and always appeared to consider it the cussedest foolishness out. But that cat, you know, was always agin new-fangled arrangements. Somehow he never could abide 'em. You know how it is with old habits. But by and by Tom Quartz begun to git sort of reconciled a little, though he never could altogether understand that eternal sinking of a shaft and never panning out anything. At last he got to coming down in the shaft hisself to try to cipher it out, and when he'd git the blues and feel kind of scruffy and aggravated and disgusted, knowing as he did that the bills was running up all the time and we weren't making a cent, he would curl up on a gunny sack in the corner and go to sleep. Well, one day when the shaft was down about 8 foot, the rock got so hard that we had to put in a blast, the first blasting we'd ever done since Tom Quartz was born.
And then we lit the fuse and clumb out and got off about 50 yards and forgot and left Tom Quartz sound asleep on the gunny sack. In about a minute we seen a puff of smoke burst up out of the hole, and then everything let go with an awful crash, and about 4 million ton of rocks and dirt and smoke and the splinters shot up about a mile and a half into the air, and by George, right in the dead center of it was old Tom Quartz, a-going end over end, and a snorting and a sneezing and a clawing and a reaching for things like all possessed. But it warn't no use, you know, it warn't no use. And that was the last we see of him for about 2 minutes and a half, and then all of a sudden it began to rain rocks and rubbage, and directly he come down kerwop about 10 foot off where we stood. Well, I reckon he was perhaps the orniest looking beast you ever see. One ear was sot back on his neck, and his tail was stove up, and his eye winkers was swinged off, and he was all blacked up with powder and smoke, and all sloppy with mud and slush from one end to the other. Well, sir, it weren't no use to try to apologize. We couldn't say a word. He took a sort of a disgusted look at himself, and then he looked at us, and it was just exactly the same as if he'd said, "Gents, maybe you think it's smart to take advantage of a cat that ain't had no experience of quartz mining, but I think different." And then he turned on his heel and marched off home without ever saying another word. Well, that was just his style, and maybe you won't believe it, but after that you never see a cat so prejudiced agin quartz mining as what he was. And by, when he did get to going down in the shaft again, you'd have been astonished at his sagacity. The minute we'd tetch off a blast and the fuse begin to sizzle, he'd give a look as much to say, "Well, I'll have to get you to excuse me," and it was surprising the way he'd shin out of that hole and go for a tree. Sagacity? It ain't no name for it. 'Twas inspiration. I said, "Well, Mr. Baker, his prejudice against quartz mining was remarkable, considering how he came by it. Couldn't you ever cure him of it?" "Cure him? No. When Tom Quartz was sot once, he was always sot, and you might have blowed him up as much as 3 million times, and you'd never have broken him of his cussed prejudice agin quartz mining." The affection and the pride that lit up Baker's face when he delivered this tribute to the firmness of his humble friend of other days will always be a vivid memory with me. At the end of 2 months we had never struck a pocket. We had panned up and down the hillsides till they looked plowed like a field. We could have put in a crop of grain then, but there would have been no way to get it to market. We got many good prospects, but when the gold gave out in the pan and we dug down, hoping and longing, we found only emptiness. The pocket that should have been there was as barren as our own. At last we shouldered our pans and shovels and struck out over the hills to try new localities. We prospected around Angel's Camp in Calaveras County during 3 weeks, but had no success. Then we wandered on foot among the mountains, sleeping under the trees at night, for the weather was mild, but still we remained as scentless as the last rose of summer. That is a poor joke, but it is in pathetic harmony with the circumstances, since we were so poor ourselves. In accordance with the custom of the country, our door had always stood open and our board welcome to tramping miners. They drifted along nearly every day, and jumped their paused shovel by the threshold and took potluck with us. And now, on our own tramp, we never found cold hospitality. Our wanderings were wide and in many directions, and now I could give the reader a vivid description of the big trees and the marvels of Yosemite. But what has this reader done to me that I should persecute him? I will deliver him into the hands of less conscientious tourists, and take his blessing. Let me be charitable, though I fail in all virtues else. Note: some of the phrases in the above are mining technicalities purely, and may be a little obscure to the general reader. In placer diggings the gold is scattered all through the surface dirt. In pocket diggings it is concentrated in one little spot. In quartz the gold is in a solid, continuous vein of rock, enclosed between distinct walls of some other kind of stone, and this is the most laborious and expensive of all the different kinds of mining. Prospecting is hunting for a placer. Indications are signs of its presence. Panning out refers to the washing process by which the grains of gold are separated from the dirt. A prospect is what one finds in the first panful of dirt, and its value determines whether it is a good or a bad prospect, and whether it is worth while to tarry there or seek further. End of chapter 61.
This is Chapter 62 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 62.
After a 3 months' absence, I found myself in San Francisco again, without a cent. When my credit was about exhausted, for I had become too mean and lazy now to work on a morning paper, and there were no vacancies on the evening journals, I was created San Francisco correspondent of the Enterprise, and at the end of 5 months I was out of debt, but my interest in my work was gone. For my correspondence being a daily one, without rest or respite, I got unspeakably tired of it. I wanted another change. The vagabond instinct was strong upon me. Fortune favored, and I got a new berth, and a delightful one. It was to go down to the Sandwich Islands and write some letters for the Sacramento Union, an excellent journal and liberal with employees. We sailed in the propeller Ajax, in the middle of winter. The almanac called it winter, distinctly enough, but the weather was a compromise between spring and summer. 6 days out of port, it became summer altogether. We had some 30 passengers, among them a cheerful soul by the name of Williams, and 3 sea-worn old whale-ship captains going down to join their vessels. These latter played euchre in the smoking-room day and night, drank astonishing quantities of raw whiskey without being in the least affected by it, and were the happiest people I think I ever saw. And then there was the old Admiral, a retired whaleman. He was a roaring, terrific combination of wind and lightning and thunder, and earnest, whole-souled profanity. But nevertheless he was tender-hearted as a girl. He was a raving, deafening, devastating typhoon, laying waste the cowering seas, but with an unvexed refuge in the center where all comers were safe and at rest. Nobody could know the Admiral without liking him, and in a sudden and dire emergency I think no friend of his would know which to choose, to be cursed by him or prayed for by a less efficient person. His title of Admiral was more strictly official than any ever worn by a naval officer before or since, perhaps, for it was the voluntary offering of a whole nation, and came direct from the people themselves without any intermediate red tape, the people of the Sandwich Islands. It was a title that came to him freighted with affection and honor, and appreciation of his unpretending merit, and in testimony of the genuineness of the title, it was publicly ordained that an exclusive flag should be devised for him and used solely to welcome his coming and wave him Godspeed in his going. From that time forth, whenever his ship was signaled in the offing, or he catted his anchor and stood out to sea, that ensign streamed from the royal halyards on the Parliament House, and the nation lifted their hats to it with spontaneous accord. Yet he had never fired a gun or fought a battle in his life. When I knew him on board the Ajax he was 72 years old, and had plowed the salt water 61 of them. For 16 years he had gone in and out of the harbor of Honolulu in command of a whale ship, and for 16 more had been captain of a San Francisco and Sandwich Island passenger packet, and had never had an accident or lost a vessel. The simple natives knew him for a friend who never failed them, and regarded him as children regard a father. It was a dangerous thing to oppress them when the roaring Admiral was around. 2 years before I knew the Admiral, he had retired from the sea on a competence, and sworn a colossal 9-jointed oath that he would never go within smelling distance of the salt water again as long as he lived. And he had conscientiously kept it.
That is to say, he considered he had kept it, and it would have been more than dangerous to suggest to him even in the gentlest way that making 11 long sea voyages as a passenger during the 2 years that had transpired since he "retired" was only keeping the general spirit of it and not the strict letter. The Admiral knew only one narrow line of conduct to pursue in any and all cases where there was a fight, and that was to shoulder his way straight in without an inquiry as to the rights or the merits of it, and take the part of the weaker side. And this was the reason why he was always sure to be present at the trial of any universally execrated criminal, to oppress and intimidate the jury with a vindictive pantomime of what he would do to them if he ever caught them out of the box. And this was why harried cats and outlawed dogs that knew him confidently took sanctuary under his chair in time of trouble. In the beginning he was the most frantic and bloodthirsty Union man that drew breath in the shadow of the flag. But the instant the Southerners began to go down before the sweep of the Northern armies, he ran up the Confederate colors, and from that time till the end was a rampant and inexorable secessionist. He hated intemperance with a more uncompromising animosity than any individual I have ever met, of either sex, and he was never tired of storming against it and beseeching friends and strangers alike to be wary and drink with moderation. And yet, if any creature had been guileless enough to intimate that his absorbing 9 gallons of straight whiskey during our voyage was any fraction short of rigid or inflexible abstemiousness, in that self-same moment the old man would have spun him to the uttermost parts of the earth in the whirlwind of his wrath. Mind, I am not saying his whiskey ever affected his head or his legs, for it did not, in even the slightest degree. He was a capacious container, but he did not hold enough for that. He took a level tumbler full of whiskey every morning before he put his clothes on, to "sweeten his bilge water," he said. He took another after he got the most of his clothes on, to "settle his mind" and give him his bearings. He then shaved and put on a clean shirt, after which he recited the Lord's Prayer in a fervent thundering bass that shook the ship to her kelson and suspended all conversation in the main cabin. Then, at this stage, being invariably by the head or by the stern, or listed to port or starboard, he took one more to put him on an even keel, so that he would mind his hellum and not miss stays and go about every time he came up in the wind. And now his stateroom door swung open, and the sun of his benignant face beamed redly out upon men and women and children, and he roared his "Shipmates ahoy!" in a way that was calculated to wake the dead and precipitate the final resurrection, and forth he strode, a picture to look at and a presence to enforce attention. Stalwart and portly, not a gray hair, broad-brimmed slouch hat, semi-sailor toggery of blue navy flannel, roomy and ample, a stately expanse of shirt-front and a liberal amount of black silk neckcloth tied with a sailor knot, large chain and imposing seals impending from his fob, awe-inspiring feet, and a hand like a hand of Providence, as his whaling brethren expressed it. Wristbands and sleeves pushed back halfway to the elbow, out of respect for the warm weather, and exposing hairy arms, gaudy with red and blue anchors, ships, and goddesses of liberty tattooed in India ink. But these details were only secondary matters. His face was the lodestone that chained the eye. It was a sultry disk, glowing determinately out through a weather-beaten mask of mahogany, and studded with warts, seamed with scars, blazed all over with unfailing fresh slips of the razor, and with cheery eyes under shaggy brows, contemplating the world from over the back of a gnarled crag of a nose that loomed vast and lonely out of the undulating immensity that spread away from its foundation. At his heels frisked the darling of his bachelor estate, his terrier Fan, a creature no larger than a squirrel. The main part of his daily life was occupied in looking after Fan in a motherly way, and doctoring her for 100 ailments which existed only in his imagination. The Admiral seldom read newspapers, and when he did he never believed anything they said. He read nothing and believed in nothing but the Old Guard, a secession periodical published in New York. He carried a dozen copies of it with him, always, and referred to them for all required information. If it was not there, he supplied it himself, out of a bountiful fancy, inventing history, names, dates, and everything else necessary to make his point good in an argument. Consequently, he was a formidable antagonist in a dispute. Whenever he swung clear of the record and began to create history, the enemy was helpless and had to surrender. Indeed, the enemy could not keep from betraying some little spark of indignation at his manufactured history, and when it came to indignation, that was the Admiral's very best hold. He was always ready for a political argument, and if nobody started one he would do it himself. With his third retort his temper would begin to rise, and within 5 minutes he would be blowing a gale, and within 15 his smoking-room audience would be utterly stormed away, and the old man left solitary and alone, banging the table with his fist, kicking the chairs, and roaring a hurricane of profanity. It got so, after a while, that whenever the Admiral approached, with politics in his eye, the passengers would drop out with quiet accord, afraid to meet him, and he would camp on a deserted field. But he found his match at last, and before a full company. At one time or another everybody had entered the lists against him and been routed, except the quiet passenger Williams. He had never been able to get an expression of opinion out of him on politics. But now, just as the Admiral drew near the door and the company were about to slip out, Williams said, "Admiral, are you certain about that circumstance concerning the clergymen you mentioned the other day?" referring to a piece of the Admiral's manufactured history. Every one was amazed at the man's rashness. The idea of deliberately inviting annihilation was a thing incomprehensible. The retreat came to a halt. Then everybody sat down again, wondering, to await the upshot of it. The Admiral himself was as surprised as any one. He paused in the door, with his red handkerchief half raised to his sweating face, and contemplated the daring reptile in the corner. "Certain of it? Am I certain of it? Do you think I've been lying about it? What do you take me for? Anybody that don't know that circumstance don't know anything. A child ought to know it. Read up your history. Read it up. And don't come asking a man if he's certain about a bit of ABC stuff that the very Southern niggers know all about." Here the Admiral's fires began to wax hot. The atmosphere thickened. The coming earthquake rumbled. He began to thunder and lighten. Within 3 minutes his volcano was in full eruption, and he was discharging flames and ashes of indignation, belching black volumes of foul history aloft, and vomiting red-hot torrents of profanity from his crater. Meantime Williams sat silent, and apparently deeply and earnestly interested in what the old man was saying. By and by, when the lull came, he said in the most deferential way, and with the gratified air of a man who has had a mystery cleared up which had been puzzling him uncomfortably, "Now I understand it. I always thought I knew that piece of history well enough, but was still afraid to trust it, because there was not that convincing particularity about it that one likes to have in history. But when you mentioned every name the other day, and every date, and every little circumstance, in their just order and sequence, I said to myself, this sounds something like this is history. This is putting it in a shape that gives a man confidence. And I said to myself afterward, I will just ask the Admiral if he is perfectly certain about the details, and if he is, I will come out and thank him for clearing this matter up for me. And that is what I want to do now, for until you set that matter right, it was nothing but just a confusion in my mind without head or tail to it." Nobody ever saw the Admiral look so mollified before, and so pleased. Nobody had ever received his bogus history as gospel before. His genuineness had always been called in question either by words or looks, but here was a man that not only swallowed it all down, but was grateful for the dose. He was taken aback. He hardly knew what to say. Even his profanity failed him. Now Williams continued, modestly and earnestly, "But, Admiral, in saying that this was the first stone thrown, and that this precipitated the war, you have overlooked a circumstance which you are perfectly familiar with, but which has escaped your memory. Now I grant you that what you have stated is correct in every detail, to wit, that on the 16th of October, 1860, two Massachusetts clergymen named Waite and Granger went in disguise to the house of John Moody in Rockport at dead of night, and dragged forth two Southern women and their two little children, and after tarring and feathering them conveyed them to Boston and burned them alive in the State House Square. And I also grant your proposition that this deed is what led to the secession of South Carolina on the 20th of December following. Very well." Here the company were pleasantly surprised to hear Williams proceed to come back at the Admiral with his own invincible weapon, clean, pure, manufactured history without a word of truth in it. "Very well, I say. But, Admiral, why overlook the Willis and Morgan case in South Carolina? You are too well informed a man not to know all about that circumstance. Your arguments and your conversations have shown you to be intimately conversant with every detail of this national quarrel. You develop matters of history every day that show plainly that you are no smatterer in it, content to nibble about the surface, but a man who has searched the depths and possessed yourself of everything that has a bearing upon the great question. Therefore, let me just recall to your mind that Willis and Morgan case, though I see by your face that the whole thing is already passing through your memory at this moment. On the 12th of August, 1860, 2 months before the Waite and Granger affair, two South Carolina clergymen named John H. Morgan and Winthrop L. Willis, one a Methodist and the other an old-school Baptist, disguised themselves and went at midnight to the house of a planter named Thompson, Archibald F. Thompson, Vice President under Thomas Jefferson, and took thence, at midnight, his widowed aunt, a Northern woman, and her adopted child, an orphan, named Mortimer Higbie, afflicted with epilepsy and suffering at the time from white swelling on one of his legs, and compelled to walk on crutches in consequence. And the two ministers, in spite of the pleadings of the victims, dragged them to the bush, tarred and feathered them, and afterward burned them at the stake in the city of Charleston. You remember perfectly well what a stir it made. You remember perfectly well that even the Charleston Courier stigmatized the act as being unpleasant, of questionable propriety, and scarcely justifiable, and likewise that it would not be matter of surprise if retaliation ensued. And you remember also that this thing was the cause of the Massachusetts outrage. Who, indeed, were the two Massachusetts ministers? And who were the two Southern women they burned? I do not need to remind you, Admiral, with your intimate knowledge of history, that Waite was the nephew of the woman burned in Charleston, that Granger was her cousin in the second degree, and that the woman they burned in Boston was the wife of John H. Morgan, and the still loved but divorced wife of Winthrop L. Willis. Now, Admiral, it is only fair that you should acknowledge that the first provocation came from the Southern preachers, and that the Northern ones were justified in retaliating. In your arguments you never yet have shown the least disposition to withhold a just verdict, or be in any wise unfair, when authoritative history condemned your position, and therefore I have no hesitation in asking you to take the original blame from the Massachusetts ministers in this matter, and transfer it to the South Carolina clergymen, where it justly belongs." The Admiral was conquered. This sweet-spoken creature, who swallowed his fraudulent history as if it were the bread of life, basked in his furious blasphemy as if it were generous sunshine, found only calm, even-handed justice in his rampart partisanship, and flooded him with invented history so sugar-coated with flattery and deference that there was no rejecting it, was too many for him. He stammered some awkward, profane sentences about the Willis and Morgan business having escaped his memory, but that he remembered it now, and then, under pretense of giving Fan some medicine for an imaginary cough, drew out of the battle and went away a vanquished man.
Then cheers and laughter went up, and Williams, the ship's benefactor, was a hero. The news went about the vessel, champagne was ordered, and enthusiastic reception instituted in the smoking-room, and everybody flocked thither to shake hands with the conqueror. The wheelman said afterward that the admiral stood up behind the pilot-house and ripped and cursed all to himself till he loosened the smokestack guys and becalmed the mainsail. The admiral's power was broken. After that, if he began argument, somebody would bring Williams, and the old man would grow weak and begin to quiet down at once. And as soon as he was done, Williams, in his dulcet, insinuating way, would invent some history, referring for proof to the old man's own excellent memory and to copies of the Old Guard, known not to be in his possession, that would turn the tables completely and leave the admiral all aboard and helpless. By and by he came to so dread Williams and his gilded tongue that he would stop talking when he saw him approach, and finally ceased to mention politics altogether, and from that time forward there was entire peace and serenity in the ship. End of chapter 62. This is Chapter 63 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 63. On a certain bright morning the islands hove in sight, lying low on the lonely sea, and everybody climbed to the upper deck to look. After 2,000 miles of watery solitude, the vision was a welcome one. As we approached, the imposing promontory of Diamond Head rose up out of the ocean, its rugged front softened by the hazy distance, and presently the details of the land began to make themselves manifest. First the line of beach, then the plumed cocoanut trees of the tropics, then cabins of the natives, then the white town of Honolulu, said to contain between 12 and 15,000 inhabitants spread over a dead level, with streets from 20 to 30 feet wide, solid and level as a floor, most of them straight as a line, and few as crooked as a corkscrew. The further I traveled through the town, the better I liked it. Every step revealed a new contrast, disclosed something I was unaccustomed to. In place of the grand mud-colored brown fronts of San Francisco, I saw dwellings built of straw, adobes, and cream-colored, pebble-and-shell conglomerated coral, cut into oblong blocks and laid in cement. Also a great number of neat white cottages with green window-shutters. In place of front yards like billiard-tables with iron fences around them, I saw these homes surrounded by ample yards thickly clad with green grass and shaded by tall trees, through whose dense foliage the sun could scarcely penetrate. In place of the customary geranium, calla lily, etc., languishing in dust and general debility, I saw luxurious banks and thickets of flowers, fresh as a meadow after a rain, and glowing with the richest dyes. In place of the dingy horrors of San Francisco's pleasure grove, the willows, I saw huge-bodied, wide-spreading forest trees with strange names and stranger appearance, trees that cast a shadow like a thunder-cloud, and were able to stand alone without being tied to green poles. In place of goldfish, wiggling around in glass globes, assuming countless shades and degrees of distortion through the magnifying and diminishing qualities of their transparent prison-houses, I saw cats, tom-cats, Marianne cats, long-tailed cats, bob-tailed cats, blind cats, one-eyed cats, wall-eyed cats, cross-eyed cats, gray cats, black cats, white cats, yellow cats, striped cats, spotted cats, tame cats, wild cats, singed cats, individual cats, groups of cats, platoons of cats, companies of cats, regiments of cats, armies of cats, multitudes of cats, millions of cats, and all of them sleek, fat, lazy, and sound asleep. I looked on a multitude of people, some white, in white coats, vests, pantaloons,
even white cloth shoes, made snowy with chalk duly laid on every morning, but the majority of the people were almost as dark as negroes. Women with comely features, fine black eyes, rounded forms inclining to voluptuous, clad in a single bright red or white garment that fell free and unconfined from shoulder to heel, long black hair falling loose, gypsy hats, encircled with wreaths of natural flowers of a brilliant carmine tint, plenty of dark men in various costumes, and some with nothing on but a battered stove-pipe hat tilted on the nose, and a very scant breech-clout. Certain smoke-dried children were clothed in nothing but sunshine, a very neat-fitting and picturesque apparel indeed. In place of roughs and rowdies staring and blackguarding on the corners, I saw long-haired, saddle-colored Sandwich Island maidens sitting on the ground in the shade of corner houses, gazing indolently at whatever or whoever happened along. Instead of wretched cobblestone pavements, I walked on a firm foundation of coral, built up from the bottom of the sea by the absurd but persevering insect of that name, with a light layer of lava and cinders overlying the coral, belched up out of the fathomless perdition long ago through the seared and blackened crater that stands dead and harmless in the distance now. Instead of cramped and crowded street cars, I met dusky native women sweeping by, free as the wind, on fleet horses, and astride, with gaudy riding sashes streaming like banners behind them. Instead of combined stenches of Chinadom and Brannan Street slaughter-houses, I breathed the balmy fragrance of jessamine, oleander, and the pride of India. In place of the hurry and bustle and noisy confusion of San Francisco, I moved in the midst of a summer calm as tranquil as dawn in the Garden of Eden. In place of the golden city's skirting sand hills and the placid bay, I saw on the one side a framework of tall, precipitous mountains close at hand, clad in refreshing green and cleft by deep, cool, chasm-like valleys, and in front the grand sweep of the ocean, a brilliant, transparent green near the shore, bound and bordered by a long white line of foamy spray dashing against the reef, and further out the dead blue water of the deep sea, flecked with white caps, and in the far horizon a single lonely sail, a mere accent mark to emphasize a slumberous calm and a solitude that were without sound or limit. When the sun sank down, the one intruder from other realms and persistent in suggestions of them, it was tranced luxury to sit in the perfumed air and forget that there was any world but these enchanted islands. It was such ecstasy to dream and dream till you got a bite, a scorpion bite. Then the first duty was to get up out of the grass and kill the scorpion, and the next to bathe the bitten place with alcohol or brandy, and the next to resolve to keep out of the grass in future. Then came an adjournment to the bedchamber and the pastime of writing up the day's journal with one hand and the destruction of mosquitoes with the other, a whole community of them at a slap. Then, observing an enemy approaching, a hairy tarantula on stilts, why not set the spittoon on him? It is done, and the projecting ends of his paws give a luminous idea of the magnitude of his reach. Then to bed, and become a promenade for a centipede with 42 legs on a side, and every foot hot enough to burn a hole through a rawhide. More soaking with alcohol, and a resolution to examine the bed before entering it in future. Then wait and suffer till all the mosquitoes in the neighborhood have crawled in under the bar, then slip out quietly, shut them in, and sleep peacefully on the floor till morning. Meantime, it is comforting to curse the tropics in occasional wakeful intervals. We had an abundance of fruit in Honolulu, of course: oranges, pineapples, bananas, strawberries, lemons, limes, mangoes, guavas, melons, and a rare and curious luxury called the chirimoya, which is deliciousness itself. Then there is the tamarind. I thought tamarinds were made to eat, but that was probably not the idea. I ate several, and it seemed to me that they were rather sour that year. They pursed up my lips till they resembled the stem end of a tomato, and I had to take my sustenance through a quill for 24 hours. They sharpened my teeth till I could have shaved with them, and gave them a wire edge that I was afraid would stay. But a citizen said, no, it will come off when the enamel does, which was comforting at any rate. I found afterward that only strangers eat tamarinds, but they only eat them once. End of chapter 63. This is chapter 64 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, chapter 64. In my diary of our third day in Honolulu, I find this. I am probably the most sensitive man in Hawaii tonight, especially about sitting down in the presence of my betters. I have ridden 15 or 20 miles on horseback since 5 p.m., and to tell the honest truth, I have a delicacy about sitting down at all. An excursion to Diamond Head and the King's Coconut Grove was planned today, time 4:30 p.m., the party to consist of half a dozen gentlemen and 3 ladies. They all started at the appointed hour except myself. I was at the government prison, with Captain Fish and another whale ship skipper, Captain Phillips, and got so interested in its examination that I did not notice how quickly the time was passing. Somebody remarked that it was 20 minutes past 5 o'clock, and that woke me up. It was a fortunate circumstance that Captain Phillips was along with his turnout, as he calls a top buggy that Captain Cook brought here in 1778, and a horse that was here when Captain Cook came. Captain Phillips takes a just pride in his driving and in the speed of his horse, and to his passion for displaying them I owe it that we were only 16 minutes coming from the prison to the American Hotel, a distance which has been estimated to be over half a mile. But it took some fearful driving. The captain's whip came down fast, and the blows started so much dust out of the horse's hide that during the last half of the journey we rode through an impenetrable fog, and ran by a pocket compass in the hands of Captain Fish, a whaler of 26 years' experience, who sat there through the perilous voyage as self-possessed as if he had been on the euchre-deck of his own ship, and calmly said, "Port your helm, port," from time to time, and "Hold her a little free, steady, so," and "Luff, hard down to starboard," and never once lost his presence of mind or betrayed the least anxiety by voice or manner. When we came to anchor at last, and Captain Phillips looked at his watch and said, 16 minutes, I told you it was in her. That's over 3 miles an hour. I could see he felt entitled to a compliment, and so I said I had never seen lightning go like that horse. And I never had. The landlord of the American said the party had been gone nearly an hour, but that he could give me my choice of several horses that could overtake them. I said, never mind, I preferred a safe horse to a fast one. I would like to have an excessively gentle horse, a horse with no spirit whatever, a lame one, if he had such a thing. Inside of 5 minutes I was mounted and perfectly satisfied with my outfit. I had no time to label him, "This is a horse," and so if the public took him for a sheep, I cannot help it. I was satisfied, and that was the main thing. I could see that he had as many fine points as any man's horse, and so I hung my hat on one of them, behind the saddle, and swabbed the perspiration from my face, and started. I named him after this island, Oahu, pronounced O-Wauhi. The first gate he came to, he started in. I had neither whip nor spur, and so I simply argued the case with him. He resisted argument, but ultimately yielded to insult and abuse. He backed out of that gate and steered for another one on the other side of the street. I triumphed by my former process. Within the next 600 yards he crossed the street 14 times and attempted 13 gates, and in the meantime the tropical sun was beating down and threatening to cave the top of my head in, and I was literally dripping with perspiration. He abandoned the gate business after that and went along peaceably enough, but absorbed in meditation. I noticed this latter circumstance, and it soon began to fill me with apprehension. I said to myself, this creature is planning some new outrage, some fresh deviltry or other,
No horse ever thought over a subject so profoundly as this one is doing just for nothing. The more this thing preyed upon my mind, the more uneasy I became, until the suspense became almost unbearable, and I dismounted to see if there was anything wild in his eye, for I had heard that the eye of this noblest of our domestic animals is very expressive. I cannot describe what a load of anxiety was lifted from my mind when I found that he was only asleep. I woke him up and started him into a faster walk. And then the villainy of his nature came out again. He tried to climb over a stone wall, 5 or 6 feet high. I saw that I must apply force to this horse, and that I might as well begin first as last. I plucked a stout switch from a tamarind tree, and the moment he saw it, he surrendered. He broke into a convulsive sort of a canter, which had 3 short steps in it and 1 long one, and reminded me alternately of the clattering shake of the great earthquake, and the sweeping plunging of the Ajax in a storm. And now there can be no fitter occasion than the present to pronounce a left-handed blessing upon the man who invented the American saddle. There is no seat to speak of about it. One might as well sit in a shovel, and the stirrups are nothing but an ornamental nuisance. If I were to write down here all the abuse I expended on those stirrups, it would make a large book, even without pictures. Sometimes I got one foot so far through that the stirrup partook of the nature of an anklet. Sometimes both feet were through, and I was handcuffed by the legs. And sometimes my feet got clear out and left the stirrups wildly dangling about my shins. Even when I was in proper position and carefully balanced upon the balls of my feet, there was no comfort in it, on account of my nervous dread that they were going to slip one way or the other in a moment. But the subject is too exasperating to write about. A mile and a half from town I came to a grove of tall cocoanut trees, with clean branchless stems reaching straight up 60 or 70 feet, and topped with a spray of green foliage sheltering clusters of cocoanuts, not more picturesque than a forest of colossal ragged parasols with bunches of magnified grapes under them would be. I once heard a gouty northern invalid say that a cocoanut tree might be poetical. Possibly it was, but it looked like a feather duster struck by lightning. I think that describes it better than a picture. And yet, without any question, there is something fascinating about a cocoanut tree, and graceful, too. About a dozen cottages, some frame and the others of native grass, nestled sleepily in the shade here and there. The grass cabins are of a grayish color, and are shaped much like our own cottages, only with higher and steeper roofs usually, and are made of some kind of weed strongly bound together in bundles. The roofs are very thick, and so are the walls. The latter have square holes in them for windows. At a little distance these cabins have a furry appearance, as if they might be made of bear skins. They are very cool and pleasant inside. The King's flag was flying from the roof of one of the cottages, and His Majesty was probably within. He owns the whole concern thereabouts, and passes his time there frequently, on sultry days, laying off. The spot is called the King's Grove. Near by is an interesting ruin, the meager remains of an ancient heathen temple, a place where human sacrifices were offered up in those old bygone days, when the simple child of nature, yielding momentarily to sin when sorely tempted, acknowledged his error when calm reflection had shown it him, and came forward with noble frankness and offered up his grandmother as an atoning sacrifice. In those old days, when the luckless sinner could keep on cleansing his conscience and achieving periodical happiness, as long as his relations held out. Long, long before the missionaries braved 1,000 privations to come and make them permanently miserable by telling them how beautiful and how blissful a place heaven is, and how nearly impossible it is to get there, and showed the poor native how dreary a place perdition is, and what unnecessarily liberal facilities there are for going to it. Showed him how, in his ignorance, he had gone and fooled away all his kinfolks to no purpose. Showed him what rapture it is to work all day long for 50 cents to buy food for next day with, as compared with fishing for pastime and lolling in the shade through eternal summer,
and eating of the bounty that nobody labored to provide but nature. How sad it is to think of the multitudes who have gone to their graves in this beautiful island and never knew there was a hell. This ancient temple was built of rough blocks of lava, and was simply a roofless enclosure 130 feet long and 70 wide, nothing but naked walls, very thick, but not much higher than a man's head. They will last for ages, no doubt, if left unmolested. Its 3 altars and other sacred appurtenances have crumbled and passed away years ago. It is said that in the old times thousands of human beings were slaughtered here, in the presence of naked and howling savages. If these mute stones could speak, what tales they could tell, what pictures they could describe, of fettered victims writhing under the knife, of massed forms straining forward out of the gloom, with ferocious faces lit up by the sacrificial fires, of the background of ghostly trees, of the dark pyramid of Diamond Head standing sentinel over the uncanny scene, and the peaceful moon looking down upon it through rifts in the cloud-rack. When Kamehameha, pronounced Kamehameha, the Great, who was a sort of a Napoleon in military genius and uniform success, invaded this island of Oahu 3/4 of a century ago, and exterminated the army sent to oppose him, and took full and final possession of the country, he searched out the dead body of the king of Oahu and those of the principal chiefs, and impaled their heads on the walls of this temple. Those were savage times when this old slaughter-house was in its prime. The king and the chiefs ruled the common herd with a rod of iron, made them gather all the provisions the masters needed, build all the houses and temples, stand all the expenses of whatever kind, take kicks and cuffs for thanks, drag out lives well favored with misery, and then suffer death for trifling offenses, or yield up their lives on the sacrificial altars to purchase favors from the gods for their hard rulers. The missionaries have clothed them, educated them, broken up the tyrannous authority of their chiefs, and given them freedom and the right to enjoy whatever their hands and brains produce, with equal laws for all, and punishment for all alike who transgress them. The contrast is so strong, the benefit conferred upon this people by the missionaries is so prominent, so palpable, and so unquestionable, that the frankest compliment I can pay them, and the best, is simply to point to the condition of the Sandwich Islanders of Captain Cook's time, and their condition today. Their work speaks for itself. End of chapter 64. This is Chapter 65 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 65. By and by, after a rugged climb, we halted on the summit of a hill which commanded a far-reaching view. The moon rose and flooded mountain and valley and ocean with a mellow radiance, and out of the shadows of the foliage the distant lights of Honolulu glinted like an encampment of fireflies. The air was heavy with the fragrance of flowers. The halt was brief. Gaily laughing and talking, the party galloped on, and I clung to the pommel and cantered after. Presently we came to a place where no grass grew, a wide expanse of deep sand. They said it was an old battle-ground. All around, everywhere, not 3 feet apart, the bleached bones of men gleamed white in the moonlight. We picked up a lot of them for mementos. I got quite a number of arm bones and leg bones of great chiefs, maybe, who had fought savagely in that fearful battle in the old days when blood flowed like wine where we now stood, and wore the choicest of them out on Oahu afterward, trying to make him go. All sorts of bones could be found except skulls, but a citizen said, irreverently, that there had been an unusual number of skull hunters there lately, a species of sportsmen I had never heard of before. Nothing whatever is known about this place. Its story is a secret that will never be revealed. The oldest natives make no pretense of being possessed of its history. They say these bones were here when they were children. They were here when their grandfathers were children, but how they came here they can only conjecture. Many people believe this spot to be an ancient battle-ground, and it is usual to call it so. And they believe that these skeletons have lain for ages just where their proprietors fell in the great fight. Other people believe that Kamehameha I fought his first battle here. On this point I have heard a story which may have been taken from one of the numerous books which have been written concerning these islands. I do not know where the narrator got it. He said that when Kamehameha, who was at first merely a subordinate chief on the island of Hawaii, landed here, he brought a large army with him and encamped at Waikiki. The Oahuans marched against him, and so confident were they of success that they readily acceded to a demand of their priests that they should draw a line where these bones now lie, and take an oath that, if forced to retreat at all, they would never retreat beyond this boundary. The priests told them that death and everlasting punishment would overtake any who violated the oath, and the march was resumed. Kamehameha drove them back step by step. The priests fought in the front rank, and exhorted them both by voice and inspiring example to remember their oath, to die if need be, but never cross the fatal line. The struggle was manfully maintained, but at last the chief priest fell, pierced to the heart with a spear, and the unlucky omen fell like a blight upon the brave souls at his back. With a triumphant shout the invaders pressed forward. The line was crossed. The offended gods deserted the despairing army, and, accepting the doom their perjury had brought upon them, they broke and fled over the plain where Honolulu stands now. Up the beautiful Nuuanu Valley, paused a moment, hemmed in by precipitous mountains on either hand, and the frightful precipice of the Paree in front, and then were driven over, a sheer plunge of 600 feet. The story is pretty enough, but Mr. Jarvis's excellent history says the Oahuans were entrenched in Nuuanu Valley, that Kamehameha ousted them, routed them, pursued them up the valley, and drove them over the precipice. He makes no mention of our boneyard at all in his book. Impressed by the profound silence and repose that rested over the beautiful landscape, and being, as usual, in the rear, I gave voice to my thoughts. I said, "What a picture is here slumbering in the solemn glory of the moon! How strong the rugged outlines of the dead volcano stand out against the clear sky! What a snowy fringe marks the bursting of the surf over the long, curved reef! How calmly the dim city sleeps yonder in the plain! How soft the shadows lie upon the stately mountains that border the dream-haunted Maua Valley! What a grand pyramid of billowy clouds towers above the storied Paree! How the grim warriors of the past seem flocking in ghostly squadrons to their ancient battlefield again! How the wails of the dying well up from the—" At this point the horse called Oahu sat down in the sand. Sat down to listen, I suppose. Never mind what he heard. I stopped apostrophizing, and convinced him that I was not a man to allow contempt of court on the part of a horse. I broke the backbone of a chief over his rump, and set out to join the cavalcade again. Very considerably fagged out, we arrived in town at 9 o'clock at night, myself in the lead, for when my horse finally came to understand that he was homeward bound and hadn't far to go, he turned his attention strictly to business. This is a good time to drop in a paragraph of information. There is no regular livery stable in Honolulu, or indeed in any part of the kingdom of Hawaii. Therefore, unless you are acquainted with wealthy residents, who all have good horses, you must hire animals of the wretchedest description from the Kanakas, i.e., natives. Any horse you hire, even though it be from a white man, is not often of much account, because it will be brought in for you from some ranch, and has necessarily been leading a hard life. If the Kanakas who have been caring for him, inveterate riders they are, have not ridden him half to death every day themselves, you can depend upon it they have been doing the same thing by proxy, by clandestinely hiring him out. At least,
So I am informed. The result is that no horse has a chance to eat, drink, rest, recuperate, or look well or feel well, and so strangers go about the islands mounted as I was today. In hiring a horse from a Kanaka, you must have all your eyes about you, because you can rest satisfied that you are dealing with a shrewd, unprincipled rascal. You may leave your door open and your trunk unlocked as long as you please, and he will not meddle with your property. He has no important vices and no inclination to commit robbery on a large scale, but if he can get ahead of you in the horse business, he will take a genuine delight in doing it. This trait is characteristic of horse jockeys the world over, is it not? He will overcharge you if he can. He will hire you a fine-looking horse at night, anybody's, maybe the king's, if the royal steed be in a convenient view, and bring you the mate to my Oahu in the morning, and contend that it is the same animal. If you make trouble, he will get out by saying it was not himself who made the bargain with you, but his brother, who went out in the country this morning. They have always got a brother to shift the responsibility upon. A victim said to one of these fellows one day, "But I know I hired the horse of you, because I noticed that scar on your cheek." The reply was not bad. "Oh, yes, yes, my brother all the same, we twins." A friend of mine, J. Smith, hired a horse yesterday, the Kanaka warranting him to be in excellent condition. Smith had a saddle and blanket of his own, and he ordered the Kanaka to put these on the horse. The Kanaka protested that he was perfectly willing to trust the gentleman with the saddle that was already on the animal, but Smith refused to use it. The change was made. Then Smith noticed that the Kanaka had only changed the saddles, and had left the original blanket on the horse. He said he forgot to change the blankets, and so, to cut the bother short, Smith mounted and rode away. The horse went lame a mile from town, and afterward got to cutting up some extraordinary capers. Smith got down and took off the saddle, but the blanket stuck fast to the horse, glued to a procession of raw places. The Kanaka's mysterious conduct stood explained. Another friend of mine bought a pretty good horse from a native, a day or two ago, after a tolerably thorough examination of the animal. He discovered today that the horse was as blind as a bat in one eye. He meant to have examined that eye, and came home with a general notion that he had done it, but he remembers now that every time he made the attempt his attention was called to something else by his victimizer. One more instance, and then I will pass to something else. I am informed that when a certain Mr. L., a visiting stranger, was here, he bought a pair of very respectable-looking match horses from a native. They were in a little stable with a partition through the middle of it, one horse in each apartment. Mr. L. examined one of them critically through a window, the Kanaka's brother having gone to the country with the key, and then went around the house and examined the other through a window on the other side. He said it was the neatest match he had ever seen, and paid for the horses on the spot. Whereupon the Kanaka departed to join his brother in the country. The fellow had shamefully swindled L. There was only one match horse, and he had examined his starboard side through one window and his port side through another. I decline to believe this story, but I give it because it is worth something as a fanciful illustration of a fixed fact, namely, that the Kanaka horse jockey is fertile in invention and elastic in conscience. You can buy a pretty good horse for $40 or $50, and a good enough horse for all practical purposes for $2.50. I estimate Oahu to be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 cents. A good deal better animal than he is was sold here day before yesterday for $1.75, and sold again today for $2.25. Williams bought a handsome and lively little pony yesterday for $10, and about the best common horse on the island, and he is a really good one, sold yesterday with Mexican saddle and bridle for $70, a horse which is well and widely known and greatly respected for his speed, good disposition, and everlasting bottom. You give your horse a little grain once a day. It comes from San Francisco and is worth about 2 cents a pound, and you give him as much hay as he wants. It is cut and brought to the market by natives, and is not very good. It is baled into long, round bundles about the size of a large man. One of them is stuck by the middle on each end of a 6-foot pole, and the Kanaka shoulders the pole and walks about the streets between the upright bales in search of customers. These hay bales, thus carried, have a general resemblance to a colossal capital H. The hay bundles cost 25 cents apiece, and one will last a horse about a day. You can get a horse for a song, a week's hay for another song, and you can turn your animal loose among the luxuriant grass in your neighbor's broad front yard without a song at all. You do it at midnight, and stable the beast again before morning. You have been at no expense thus far, but when you come to buy a saddle and bridle they will cost you from $20 to $35. You can hire a horse, saddle, and bridle at from $7 to $10 a week, and the owner will take care of them at his own expense. It is time to close this day's record, bedtime. As I prepare for sleep, a rich voice rises out of the still night, and far as this ocean rock is toward the ends of the earth, I recognize a familiar home air. But the words seem somewhat out of joint. Waikiki lantoni oi ka huli huli wauhu. Translated, that means, when we were marching through Georgia. End of chapter 65. This is Chapter 66 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 66. Passing through the marketplace, we saw that feature of Honolulu under its most favorable auspices, that is, in the full glory of Saturday afternoon, which is a festive day with the natives. The native girls, by twos and threes, and parties of a dozen, and sometimes in whole platoons and companies, went cantering up and down the neighboring streets astride of fleet but homely horses, and with their gaudy riding habits streaming like banners behind them. Such a troop of free and easy riders in their natural home, the saddle, makes a gay and graceful spectacle. The riding habit I speak of is simply a long, broad scarf, like a tavern tablecloth, brilliantly colored, wrapped around the loins once, then apparently passed between the limbs and each end thrown backward over the same, and floating and flapping behind on both sides beyond the horse's tail like a couple of fancy flags. Then, slipping the stirrup irons between her toes, the girl throws her chest forward, sits up like a major general, and goes sweeping by like the wind. The girls put on all the finery they can on Saturday afternoon, fine black silk robes, flowing red ones that nearly put your eyes out, others as white as snow, still others that discount the rainbow, and they wear their hair in nets, and trim their jaunty hats with fresh flowers, and encircle their dusky throats with home-made necklaces of the brilliant vermilion-tinted blossom of the ohia, and they fill the markets and the adjacent street with their bright presences, and smell like a rag factory on fire with their offensive coconut oil. Occasionally you see a heathen from the sunny isles away down in the South Seas, with his face and neck tattooed till he looks like the customary mendicant from Washoe who has been blown up in a mine. Some are tattooed a dead blue color down to the upper lip, masked as it were, leaving the natural light yellow skin of Micronesia unstained from thence down. Some with broad marks drawn down from hair to neck on both sides of the face, and a strip of the original yellow skin 2 inches wide down the center, a gridiron with a spoke broken out, and some with the entire face discolored with the popular mortification tint, relieved only by 1 or 2 thin, wavy threads of natural yellow running across the face from ear to ear, and eyes twinkling out of this darkness from under shadowy hat-brims, like stars in the dark of the moon. Moving among the stirring crowds, you come to the poi merchants, squatting in the shade on their hams, in true native fashion, and surrounded by purchasers. The Sandwich Islanders always squat on their hams, and who knows but they may be the old original ham sandwiches? The thought is pregnant with interest. The poi looks like common flour paste, and is kept in large bowls formed of a species of gourd, and capable of holding from 1 to 3 or 4 gallons. Poi is the chief article of food among the natives, and is prepared from the taro plant. The taro root looks like a thick, or, if you please, a corpulent sweet potato in shape, but is of a light purple color when boiled. When boiled it answers as a passable substitute for bread. The Buck Kanakas bake it underground, then mash it up well with a heavy lava pestle, mix water with it until it becomes a paste, set it aside and let it ferment, and then it is poi. And an unseductive mixture it is, almost tasteless before it ferments, and too sour for a luxury afterward. But nothing is more nutritious. When solely used, however, it produces acrid humors, a fact which sufficiently accounts for the humorous character of the Kanakas. I think there must be as much of a knack in handling poi as there is in eating with chopsticks. The forefinger is thrust into the mess and stirred quickly round several times, and drawn as quickly out, thickly coated, just as if it were poulticed. The head is thrown back, the finger inserted in the mouth, and the delicacy stripped off and swallowed, the eye closing gently meanwhile in a languid sort of ecstasy. Many a different finger goes into the same bowl, and many a different kind of dirt and shade and quality of flavor is added to the virtues of its contents. Around a small shanty was collected a crowd of natives buying the awa root. It is said that but for the use of this root the destruction of the people in former times by certain imported diseases would have been far greater than it was, and by others it is said that this is merely a fancy. All agree that poi will rejuvenate a man who is used up and his vitality almost annihilated by hard drinking, and that in some kinds of diseases it will restore health after all medicines have failed. But all are not willing to allow to the awa the virtues claimed for it. The natives manufacture an intoxicating drink from it which is fearful in its effects when persistently indulged in. It covers the body with dry, white scales, inflames the eyes, and causes premature decrepitude. Although the man before whose establishment we stopped has to pay a government license of $800 a year for the exclusive right to sell awa root, it is said that he makes a small fortune every 12 months, while saloon-keepers who pay $1,000 a year for the privilege of retailing whiskey, etc., only make a bare living. We found the fish market crowded, for the native is very fond of fish, and eats the article raw and alive. Let us change the subject. In old times here Saturday was a grand gala day indeed. All the native population of the town forsook their labors, and those of the surrounding country journeyed to the city. Then the white folks had to stay indoors, for every street was so packed with charging cavaliers and cavalieresses that it was next to impossible to thread one's way through the cavalcades without getting crippled. At night they feasted, and the girls danced the lascivious hula-hula, a dance that is said to exhibit the very perfection of educated notion of limb and arm, hand, head, and body, and the exactest uniformity of movement and accuracy of time. It was performed by a circle of girls with no raiment on them to speak of, who went through an infinite variety of motions and figures without prompting, and yet so true was their time, and in such perfect concert did they move, that when they were placed in a straight line, hands, arms, bodies, limbs, and heads waved, swayed, gesticulated, bowed, stooped, whirled, squirmed, twisted, and undulated, as if they were part and parcel of a single individual. And it was difficult to believe they were not moved in a body by some exquisite piece of mechanism. Of late years, however, Saturday has lost most of its quondam gala features. This weekly stampede of the natives interfered too much with labor and the interests of the white folks, and by sticking in a law here and preaching a sermon there, and by various other means, they gradually broke it up. The demoralizing hula-hula was forbidden to be performed save at night, with closed doors, in presence of few spectators, and only by permission duly procured from the authorities and the payment of $10 for the same. There are few girls nowadays able to dance this ancient national dance in the highest perfection of the art. The missionaries have Christianized and educated all the natives. They all belong to the church, and there is not one of them above the age of 8 years but can read and write with facility in the native tongue. It is the most universally educated race of people outside of China. They have any quantity of books, printed in the Kanaka language, and all the natives are fond of reading. They are inveterate churchgoers. Nothing can keep them away. All this ameliorating cultivation has at last built up in the native women a profound respect for chastity in other people. Perhaps that is enough to say on that head. The national sin will die out when the race does, but perhaps not earlier. But doubtless this purifying is not far off, when we reflect that contact with civilization and the whites has reduced the native population from 400,000, Captain Cook's estimate, to 55,000 in something over 80 years. Society is a queer medley in this notable missionary, whaling, and governmental center. If you get into conversation with a stranger and experience that natural desire to know what sort of ground you are treading on by finding out what manner of man your stranger is, strike out boldly and address him as Captain. Watch him narrowly, and if you see by his countenance that you are on the wrong tack, ask him where he preaches. It is a safe bet that he is either a missionary or captain of a whaler. I am now personally acquainted with 72 captains and 96 missionaries. The captains and ministers form one half of the population. The third fourth is composed of common Kanakas and mercantile foreigners and their families, and the final fourth is made up of high officers of the Hawaiian government, and there are just about cats enough for 3 apiece all around. A solemn stranger met me in the suburbs the other day and said, "Good morning, your reverence. Preach in the stone church yonder, no doubt?" "No, I don't. I'm not a preacher." "Really, I beg your pardon, Captain. I trust you had a good season. How much oil?" "Oil? What do you take me for? I'm not a whaler." "Oh, I beg 1,000 pardons, your Excellency." "Major General in the household troops, no doubt?" "Minister of the Interior, likely." "Secretary of War?" "First Gentleman of the Bedchamber." "Commissioner of the Royal—" "Stuff! I'm no official. I'm not connected in any way with the government." "Bless my life! Then who the mischief are you? What the mischief are you? And how the mischief did you get here? And where in thunder did you come from?" "I'm only a private personage, an unassuming stranger, lately arrived from America." "No? Not a missionary, not a whaler, not a member of His Majesty's government, not even Secretary of the Navy? Ah, heaven! It is too blissful to be true. Alas, I do but dream. And yet that noble, honest countenance, those oblique, ingenious eyes, that massive head, incapable of anything. Your hand, give me your hand, bright waif. Excuse these tears. For 16 weary years I have yearned for a moment like this, and—" Here his feelings were too much for him, and he swooned away. I pitied this poor creature from the bottom of my heart. I was deeply moved. I shed a few tears on him and kissed him for his mother. I then took what small change he had and shoved. End of chapter 66.
This is Chapter 67 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 67. I still quote from my journal. I found the national legislature to consist of half a dozen white men and some 30 or 40 natives. It was a dark assemblage.
The nobles and ministers, about a dozen of them altogether, occupied the extreme left of the hall, with David Kalakaua, the King's Chamberlain, and Prince William at the head. The President of the Assembly, His Royal Highness M. Kekuanaoa is not of the blood royal. He derives his princely rank from his wife, who was a daughter of Kamehameha the Great. Under other monarchies the male line takes precedence of the female in tracing genealogies, but here the opposite is the case, the female line takes precedence. The reason for this is exceedingly sensible, and I recommend it to the aristocracy of Europe. They say it is easy to know who a man's mother was, but, etc., etc. And the vice president, the latter a white man, sat in the pulpit, if I may so term it. The president is the king's father. He is an erect, strongly built, massive-featured, white-haired, tawny old gentleman of 80 years of age or thereabouts. He was simply but well dressed, in a blue cloth coat and white vest, and white pantaloons without spot, dust, or blemish upon them. He bears himself with a calm, stately dignity, and is a man of noble presence. He was a young man and a distinguished warrior under that terrific fighter, Kamehameha I, more than half a century ago. A knowledge of his career suggested some such thought as this: this man, naked as the day he was born, and war-club and spear in hand, has charged at the head of a horde of savages against other hordes of savages more than a generation and a half ago, and reveled in slaughter and carnage, has worshipped wooden images on his devout knees, has seen hundreds of his race offered up in heathen temples as sacrifices to wooden idols at a time when no missionary's foot had ever pressed this soil, and he had never heard of the white man's God, has believed his enemy could secretly pray him to death, has seen the day, in his childhood, when it was a crime punishable by death for a man to eat with his wife, or for a plebeian to let his shadow fall upon the king. And now look at him, an educated Christian, neatly and handsomely dressed, a high-minded, elegant gentleman, a traveler in some degree, and one who has been the honored guest of royalty in Europe, a man practiced in holding the reins of an enlightened government, and well versed in the politics of his country and in general practical information. Look at him, sitting there presiding over the deliberations of a legislative body among whom are white men, a grave, dignified, statesmanlike personage, and as seemingly natural and fitted to the place as if he had been born in it and had never been out of it in his lifetime. How the experiences of this old man's eventful life shame the cheap inventions of romance. The Christianizing of the natives has hardly even weakened some of their barbarian superstitions, much less destroyed them. I have just referred to one of these. It is still a popular belief that if your enemy can get hold of any article belonging to you, he can get down on his knees over it and pray you to death. Therefore, many a native gives up and dies merely because he imagines that some enemy is putting him through a course of damaging prayer. This praying an individual to death seems absurd enough at a first glance, but then when we call to mind some of the pulpit efforts of certain of our own ministers, the thing looks plausible. In former times, among the islanders, not only a plurality of wives was customary, but a plurality of husbands likewise. Some native women of noble rank had as many as 6 husbands. A woman thus supplied did not reside with all her husbands at once, but lived several months with each in turn. An understood sign hung at her door during these months. When the sign was taken down, it meant "Next." In those days, woman was rigidly taught to know her place. Her place was to do all the work, take all the cuffs, provide all the food, and content herself with what was left after her lord had finished his dinner. She was not only forbidden by ancient law and under penalty of death to eat with her husband or enter a canoe, but was debarred under the same penalty from eating bananas, pineapples, oranges, and other choice fruits at any time or in any place.
she had to confine herself pretty strictly to poi and hard work. These poor ignorant heathen seem to have had a sort of groping idea of what came of woman eating fruit in the Garden of Eden, and they did not choose to take any more chances. But the missionaries broke up this satisfactory arrangement of things. They liberated woman and made her the equal of man. The natives had a romantic fashion of burying some of their children alive when the family became larger than necessary. The missionaries interfered in this matter, too, and stopped it. To this day the natives are able to lie down and die whenever they want to, whether there is anything the matter with them or not. If a Kanaka takes a notion to die, that is the end of him. Nobody can persuade him to hold on. All the doctors in the world could not save him. A luxury which they enjoy more than anything else is a large funeral. If a person wants to get rid of a troublesome native, it is only necessary to promise him a fine funeral and name the hour, and he will be on hand to the minute, at least his remains will. All the natives are Christians now, but many of them still desert to the great shark god for temporary succor in time of trouble. An eruption of the great volcano of Kilauea, or an earthquake, always brings a deal of latent loyalty to the great shark god to the surface. It is common report that the king, educated, cultivated, and refined Christian gentleman as he undoubtedly is, still turns to the idols of his fathers for help when disaster threatens. A planter caught a shark, and one of his Christianized natives testified his emancipation from the thrall of ancient superstition by assisting to dissect the shark after a fashion forbidden by his abandoned creed. But remorse shortly began to torture him. He grew moody and sought solitude, brooded over his sin, refused food, and finally said he must die and ought to die, for he had sinned against the great shark god and could never know peace any more. He was proof against persuasion and ridicule, and in the course of a day or two took to his bed and died, although he showed no symptom of disease. His young daughter followed his lead and suffered a like fate within the week. Superstition is ingrained in the native blood and bone, and it is only natural that it should crop out in time of distress. Wherever one goes in the islands, he will find small piles of stones by the wayside, covered with leafy offerings, placed there by the natives to appease evil spirits or honor local deities belonging to the mythology of former days. In the rural districts of any of the islands, the traveler hourly comes upon parties of dusky maidens bathing in the streams or in the sea without any clothing on, and exhibiting no very intemperate zeal in the matter of hiding their nakedness. When the missionaries first took up their residence in Honolulu, the native women would pay their families frequent friendly visits, day by day, not even clothed with a blush. It was found a hard matter to convince them that this was rather indelicate. Finally, the missionaries provided them with long, loose, calico robes, and that ended the difficulty, for the women would troop through the town stark naked with their robes folded under their arms, march to the missionary houses, and then proceed to dress. The natives soon manifested a strong proclivity for clothing, but it was shortly apparent that they only wanted it for grandeur. The missionaries imported a quantity of hats, bonnets, and other male and female wearing apparel, instituted a general distribution, and begged the people not to come to church naked next Sunday as usual. And they did not, but the national spirit of unselfishness led them to divide up with neighbors who were not at the distribution, and next Sabbath the poor preachers could hardly keep countenance before their vast congregations. In the midst of the reading of a hymn a brown, stately dame would sweep up the aisle with a world of airs, with nothing in the world on but a stovepipe hat and a pair of cheap gloves. Another dame would follow, tricked out in a man's shirt, and nothing else. Another one would enter with a flourish, with simply the sleeves of a bright calico dress tied around her waist, and the rest of the garment dragging behind like a peacock's tail off duty. A stately buck Kanaka would stalk in with a woman's bonnet on, wrong side before, only this, and nothing more. After him would stride his fellow with the legs of a pair of pantaloons tied around his neck. the rest of his person untrammeled. In his rear would come another gentleman, simply gotten up in a fiery necktie and a striped vest. The poor creatures were beaming with complacency and wholly unconscious of any absurdity in their appearance. They gazed at each other with happy admiration, and it was plain to see that the young girls were taking note of what each other had on, as naturally as if they had always lived in a land of Bibles and knew what churches were made for. Here was the evidence of a dawning civilization. The spectacle which the congregation presented was so extraordinary, and withal so moving, that the missionaries found it difficult to keep to the text and go on with the services. And by, when the simple children of the sun began a general swapping of garments in open meeting, and produced some irresistibly grotesque effects in the course of redressing, there was nothing for it but to cut the thing short with the benediction and dismiss the fantastic assemblage. In our country children play keep house, and in the same high-sounding but miniature way the grown folk here, with the poor little material of slender territory and meagre population, play empire. There is His Royal Majesty the King, with a New York detective's income of $30,000 or $35,000 a year from the Royal Civil List and the Royal Domain. He lives in a 2-story frame palace. And there is the royal family, the customary hive of royal brothers, sisters, cousins, and other noble drones and vagrants usual to monarchy, all with a spoon in the national pap dish, and all bearing such titles as His or Her Royal Highness the Prince or Princess So-and-so. Few of them can carry their royal splendors far enough to ride in carriages, however. They sport the economical Kanaka horse or hoof it with the plebeians. Then there is His Excellency the Royal Chamberlain, a sinecure, for His Majesty dresses himself with his own hands, except when he is ruralizing at Waikiki, and then he requires no dressing. Next we have His Excellency the Commander-in-Chief of the Household Troops, whose forces consist of about the number of soldiers usually placed under a corporal in other lands. Next comes the Royal Steward and the Grand Equerry in waiting, high dignitaries with modest salaries and little to do. Then we have His Excellency the First Gentleman of the Bedchamber, an office as easy as it is magnificent. Next we come to His Excellency the Prime Minister, a renegade American from New Hampshire, all jaw, vanity, bombast, and ignorance, a lawyer of shyster caliber, a fraud by nature, a humble worshipper of the scepter above him, a reptile never tired of sneering at the land of his birth, or glorifying the 10-acre kingdom that has adopted him. Salary, $4,000 a year, vast consequence, and no perquisites. Then we have His Excellency the Imperial Minister of Finance, who handles $1 million of public money a year, sends in his annual budget with great ceremony, talks prodigiously of finance, suggests imposing schemes for paying off the national debt of $150,000, and does it all for $4,000 a year and unimaginable glory. Next we have His Excellency the Minister of War, who holds sway over the royal armies. They consist of 230 uniformed Kanakas, mostly brigadier generals, and if the country ever gets into trouble with a foreign power we shall probably hear from them. I knew an American whose copper-plate visiting card bore this impressive legend: Lieutenant Colonel in the Royal Infantry. To say that he was proud of this distinction is stating it but tamely. The Minister of War has also in his charge some venerable swivels on Punchbowl Hill, wherewith royal salutes are fired when foreign vessels of war enter the port. Next comes His Excellency the Minister of the Navy, a nabob who rules the Royal Fleet, a steam-tug, and a 60-ton schooner. And next comes His Grace the Lord Bishop of Honolulu, the chief dignitary of the Established Church, for when the American Presbyterian missionaries had completed the reduction of the nation to a compact condition of Christianity, native royalty stepped in and erected the grand dignity of an established Episcopal Church over it, and imported a cheap ready-made bishop from England to take charge. The chagrin of the missionaries has never been comprehensively expressed to this day, profanity not being admissible. Next comes His Excellency the Minister of Public Instruction. Next, their Excellencies the Governors of Oahu, Hawaii, etc., and after them a string of high sheriffs and other small fry, too numerous for computation. Then there are their Excellencies the Envoy Extraordinary and the Minister Plenipotentiary of His Imperial Majesty the Emperor of the French, Her British Majesty's Minister, the Minister Resident of the United States, and some 6 or 8 representatives of other foreign nations, all with sounding titles, imposing dignity, and prodigious but economical state. Imagine all this grandeur in a playhouse kingdom whose population falls absolutely short of 60,000 souls. The people are so accustomed to 9-jointed titles and colossal magnates that a foreign prince makes very little more stir in Honolulu than a Western congressman does in New York. And let it be borne in mind that there is a strictly defined court costume of so stunning a nature that it would make the clown in a circus look tame and commonplace by comparison, and each Hawaiian official dignitary has a gorgeous, vari-colored, gold-laced uniform peculiar to his office. No 2 of them are alike, and it is hard to tell which one is the loudest. The king had a drawing-room at stated intervals, like other monarchs, and when these varied uniforms congregate there, weak-eyed people have to contemplate the spectacle through smoked glass. Is there not a gratifying contrast between this latter-day exhibition and the one the ancestors of some of these magnates afforded the missionaries the Sunday after the old-time distribution of clothing? Behold what religion and civilization have wrought. End of chapter 67. This is chapter 68 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 68. While I was in Honolulu, I witnessed the ceremonious funeral of the King's sister, Her Royal Highness the Princess Victoria. According to the royal custom, the remains had lain in state at the palace 30 days, watched day and night by a guard of honor. And during all that time a great multitude of natives from the several islands had kept the palace grounds well crowded, and had made the place a pandemonium every night with their howlings and wailings, beating of tom-toms, and dancing of the, at other times, forbidden hula-hula by half-clad maidens to the music of songs of questionable decency chanted in honor of the deceased. The printed program of the funeral procession interested me at the time, and after what I have just said of Hawaiian grandiloquence in the matter of playing empire, I am persuaded that a perusal of it may interest the reader. After reading the long list of dignitaries, etc., and remembering the sparseness of the population, one is almost inclined to wonder where the material for that portion of the procession devoted to Hawaiian population generally is going to be procured. Undertaker, Royal School, Kawaiahao School, Roman Catholic School, Mai School, Honolulu Fire Department, Mechanics Benefit Union, Attending Physicians, Knonohikis, Superintendents of the Crown Lands, Knonohikis of the Private Lands of His Majesty, Knonohikis of the Private Lands of Her late Royal Highness, Governor of Oahu and Staff, Hulumanu Military Company, Household Troops, the Prince of Hawaii's own Military Company, the King's Household Servants, Servants of Her late Royal Highness, Protestant Clergy, the Clergy of the Roman Catholic Church, His Lordship Louis Maigret, the Right Reverend Bishop of Arathea, Vicar Apostolic of the Hawaiian Islands, the clergy of the Hawaiian Reformed Catholic Church, His Lordship the Right Reverend Bishop of Honolulu, Her Majesty Queen Emma's carriage, His Majesty's staff, carriage of Her late Royal Highness, carriage of Her Majesty the Queen Dowager, the King's Chancellor, Cabinet Ministers, His Excellency the Minister Resident of the United States, H.B.M.'s Commissioner, H.B.M.'s Acting Commissioner, Judges of Supreme Court, Privy Councilors, Members of Legislative Assembly, Consular Corps, Circuit Judges, Clerks of Government Departments, Members of the Bar, Collector General, Custom House Officers and Officers of the Customs,
marshal and sheriffs of the different islands, king's yeomanry, foreign residents, Ahahui Kahumanu, Hawaiian population generally, Hawaiian cavalry, police force. I resume my journal at the point where the procession arrived at the royal mausoleum. As the procession filed through the gate, the military deployed handsomely to the right and left and formed an avenue through which the long column of mourners passed to the tomb. The coffin was borne through the door of the mausoleum, followed by the king and his chiefs, the great officers of the kingdom, foreign consuls, ambassadors, and distinguished guests, Burlingame and General Van Valkenburg. Several of the kahilis were then fastened to a framework in front of the tomb, there to remain until they decay and fall to pieces, or, forestalling this, until another scion of royalty dies. At this point of the proceedings the multitude set up such a heart-broken wailing as I hope I never hear again. The soldiers fired 3 volleys of musketry, the wailing being previously silenced to permit of the guns being heard. His Highness Prince William, in a showy military uniform, the true prince, this scion of the house overthrown by the present dynasty, he was formerly betrothed to the princess, but was not allowed to marry her, stood guard and paced back and forth within the door. The privileged few who followed the coffin into the mausoleum remained some time, but the king soon came out and stood in the door and near one side of it. A stranger could have guessed his rank, although he was so simply and unpretentiously dressed, by the profound deference paid him by all persons in his vicinity, by seeing his high officers receive his quiet orders and suggestions with bowed and uncovered heads, and by observing how careful those persons who came out of the mausoleum were to avoid crowding him, although there was room enough in the doorway for a wagon to pass, for that matter. How respectfully they edged out sideways, scraping their backs against the wall and always presenting a front view of their persons to his majesty, and never putting their hats on until they were well out of the royal presence. He was dressed entirely in black, dress coat and silk hat, and looked rather democratic in the midst of the showy uniforms about him. On his breast he wore a large gold star, which was half hidden by the lapel of his coat. He remained at the door a half hour, and occasionally gave an order to the men who were erecting the kahilis, ranks of long-handled mops made of gaudy feathers, sacred to royalty. They are stuck in the ground around the tomb and left there. Before the tomb, he had the good taste to make one of them substitute black crape for the ordinary hempen rope he was about to tie one of them to the framework with. Finally he entered his carriage and drove away, and the populace shortly began to drop into his wake. While he was in view, there was but one man who attracted more attention than himself, and that was Harris, the Yankee Prime Minister. This feeble personage had crape enough around his hat to express the grief of an entire nation, and as usual he neglected no opportunity of making himself conspicuous and exciting the admiration of the simple Kanakas. Oh, noble ambition of this modern Richelieu! It is interesting to contrast the funeral ceremonies of the Princess Victoria with those of her noted ancestor Kamehameha the Conqueror, who died 50 years ago, in 1819, the year before the first missionaries came. On the 8th of May, 1819, at the age of 66, he died, as he had lived, in the faith of his country. It was his misfortune not to have come in contact with men who could have rightly influenced his religious aspirations. Judged by his advantages and compared with the most eminent of his countrymen, he may be justly styled not only great, but good. To this day his memory warms the heart and elevates the national feelings of Hawaiians. They are proud of their old warrior king. They love his name. His deeds form their historical age, and an enthusiasm everywhere prevails, shared even by foreigners who knew his worth, that constitutes the firmest pillar of the throne of his dynasty. In lieu of human victims, the custom of that age, a sacrifice of 300 dogs attended his obsequies, no mean holocaust when their national value and the estimation in which they were held are considered. The bones of Kamehameha, after being kept for a while, were so carefully concealed that all knowledge of their final resting place is now lost.
There was a proverb current among the common people that the bones of a cruel king could not be hid. They made fish-hooks and arrows of them, upon which, in using them, they vented their abhorrence of his memory in bitter execrations. The account of the circumstances of his death, as written by the native historians, is full of minute detail, but there is scarcely a line of it which does not mention or illustrate some bygone custom of the country. In this respect it is the most comprehensive document I have yet met with. I will quote it entire. When Kamehameha was dangerously sick, and the priests were unable to cure him, they said, "Be of good courage, and build a house for the god," his own private god or idol, "that thou mayest recover." The chiefs corroborated this advice of the priests, and a place of worship was prepared for Kukailimoku and consecrated in the evening. They proposed also to the king, with a view to prolong his life, that human victims should be sacrificed to his deity, upon which the greater part of the people absconded through fear of death, and concealed themselves in hiding-places till the taboo pronounced taboo, means prohibition, we have borrowed it, or sacred. The taboo was sometimes permanent, sometimes temporary, and the person or thing placed under taboo was for the time being sacred to the purpose for which it was set apart. In the above case, the victims selected under the taboo would be sacred to the sacrifice, till the taboo in which destruction impended was passed. It is doubtful whether Kamehameha approved of the plan of the chiefs and priests to sacrifice men, as he was known to say, "The men are sacred for the king," meaning that they were for the service of his successor. This information was derived from Liholiho, his son. After this, his sickness increased to such a degree that he had not strength to turn himself in his bed. When another season, consecrated for worship at the new temple, Heau, arrived, he said to his son Liholiho, "Go thou and make supplication to thy God. I am not able to go, and will offer my prayers at home." When his devotions to his feathered god, Kukailimoku, were concluded, a certain religiously disposed individual, who had a bird god, suggested to the king that through its influence his sickness might be removed. The name of this god was Pua. Its body was made of a bird, now eaten by the Hawaiians, and called in their language alai. Kamehameha was willing that a trial should be made, and 2 houses were constructed to facilitate the experiment. But while dwelling in them he became so very weak as not to receive food. After lying there 3 days, his wives, children, and chiefs, perceiving that he was very low, returned him to his own house. In the evening he was carried to the eating-house, where he took a little food in his mouth, which he did not swallow, also a cup of water. The chiefs requested him to give them his counsel, but he made no reply, and was carried back to the dwelling-house. But when near midnight, 10 o'clock perhaps, he was carried again to the place to eat, but as before he merely tasted of what was presented to him. Then Kaikiowa addressed him thus: "Here we all are, your younger brethren, your son Liholiho, and your foreigner. Impart to us your dying charge, that Liholiho and Kahumanu may hear." Then Kamehameha inquired, "What do you say?" Kaikiowa repeated, "Your counsels for us." He then said, "Move on in my good way, and—" He could proceed no further. The foreigner, Mr. Young, embraced and kissed him. Haopili also embraced him, whispering something in his ear, after which he was taken back to the house. About 12 he was carried once more to the house for eating, into which his head entered, while his body was in the dwelling-house immediately adjoining. It should be remarked that this frequent carrying of a sick chief from one house to another resulted from the taboo system then in force. There were at that time 6 houses, huts, connected with an establishment. One was for worship, one for the men to eat in, an eating-house for the women, a house to sleep in, a house in which to manufacture kapa, native cloth, and one where, at certain intervals, the women might dwell in seclusion. The sick was once more taken to his house, when he expired. This was at 2 o'clock, a circumstance from which Lelehoku derived his name. As he breathed his last, Kalaimoku came to the eating-house to order those in it to go out. There were 2 aged persons thus directed to depart. One went, the other remained on account of love to the king, by whom he had formerly been kindly sustained. The children also were sent away. Then Kalaimoku came to the house, and the chiefs had a consultation. One of them spoke thus: "This is my thought. We will eat him raw." This sounds suspicious, in view of the fact that all Sandwich Island historians, white and black, protest that cannibalism never existed in the islands. However, since they only propose to eat him raw, we won't count that. But it would certainly have been cannibalism if they had cooked him. M.T. Kahumanu, one of the dead king's widows, replied, "Perhaps his body is not at our disposal. That is more properly with his successor. Our part in him, his breath, has departed. His remains will be disposed of by Liholiho." After this conversation the body was taken into the consecrated house for the performance of the proper rites by the priest and the new king. The name of this ceremony is Uko, and when the sacred hog was baked the priest offered it to the dead body, and it became a god, the king at the same time repeating the customary prayers. Then the priest, addressing himself to the king and chiefs, said, "I will now make known to you the rules to be observed respecting persons to be sacrificed on the burial of this body. If you obtain 1 man before the corpse is removed, 1 will be sufficient. But after it leaves this house 4 will be required. If delayed until we carry the corpse to the grave, there must be 10. But after it is deposited in the grave, there must be 15. Tomorrow morning there will be a tabu, and if the sacrifice be delayed until that time, 40 men must die." Then the high priest, Hewa Hewa, inquired of the chiefs, "Where shall be the residence of King Liholiho?" They replied, "Where indeed? You of all men ought to know." Then the priest observed, "There are 2 suitable places. One is Kau, the other is Kohala." The chiefs preferred the latter, as it was more thickly inhabited. The priest added, "These are proper places for the king's residence, but he must not remain in Kona, for it is polluted." This was agreed to. It was now break of day. As he was being carried to the place of burial, the people perceived that their king was dead, and they wailed. When the corpse was removed from the house to the tomb, a distance of 1 chain, the procession was met by a certain man who was ardently attached to the deceased. He leapt upon the chiefs who were carrying the king's body. He desired to die with him on account of his love. The chiefs drove him away. He persisted in making numerous attempts, which were unavailing. Kalaimoka also had it in his heart to die with him, but was prevented by Hukio. The morning following Kamehameha's death, Liholiho and his train departed for Kohala, according to the suggestions of the priest, to avoid the defilement occasioned by the dead. At this time, if a chief died, the land was polluted, and the heirs sought a residence in another part of the country until the corpse was dissected and the bones tied in a bundle, which being done, the season of defilement terminated. If the deceased were not a chief, the house only was defiled, which became pure again on the burial of the body. Such were the laws on this subject. On the morning on which Liholiho sailed in his canoe for Kohala, the chiefs and the people mourned after their manner on occasion of a chief's death, conducting themselves like madmen and like beasts. Their conduct was such as to forbid description. The priests also put into action the sorcery apparatus, that the person who had prayed the king to death might die, for it was not believed that Kamehameha's departure was the effect either of sickness or old age. When the sorcerers set up by their fireplaces sticks with a strip of kapa flying at the top, the chief Keeaumoku, Kaumau's brother, came in a state of intoxication and broke the flagstaff of the sorcerers, from which it was inferred that Kaahumanu and her friends had been instrumental in the king's death. On this account they were subjected to abuse. You have the contrast now, and a strange one it is. This great queen, Kaahumanu,
who was subjected to abuse during the frightful orgies that followed the king's death, in accordance with ancient custom, afterward became a devout Christian, and a steadfast and powerful friend of the missionaries. Dogs were, and still are, reared and fattened for food by the natives, hence the reference to their value in one of the above paragraphs. 40 years ago it was the custom in the islands to suspend all law for a certain number of days after the death of a royal personage, and then a saturnalia ensued which one may picture to himself after a fashion, but not in the full horror of the reality. The people shaved their heads, knocked out a tooth or two, plucked out an eye sometimes, cut, bruised, mutilated, or burned their flesh, got drunk, burned each other's huts, maimed or murdered one another according to the caprice of the moment, and both sexes gave themselves up to brutal and unbridled licentiousness. And, after it all, came a torpor from which the nation slowly emerged, bewildered and dazed, as if from a hideous half-remembered nightmare. They were not the salt of the earth, those gentle children of the sun. The natives still keep up an old custom of theirs which cannot be comforting to an invalid. When they think a sick friend is going to die, a couple of dozen neighbors surround his hut and keep up a deafening wailing night and day till he either dies or gets well. No doubt this arrangement has helped many a subject to a shroud before his appointed time. They surround a hut and wail in the same heart-broken way when its occupant returns from a journey. This is their dismal idea of a welcome. A very little of it would go a great way with most of us. End of chapter 68.